The village looked quiet, and that was the most dangerous thing about it. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops. Smoke drifted lazily from shattered buildings. From a distance, Foyts appeared almost peaceful, a small Ardennes village frozen in winter silence. But silence in the Bulge never meant safety. It meant waiting. For the men watching it from the tree line, Foy was not just another objective. It was unfinished business. Weeks earlier, during the Siege of Bastogne, German forces had taken the village and turned it into a fortified strongpoint, dug in, concealed, and positioned to threaten everything the Americans held. As long as Foy remained in enemy hands, Bastogne was never truly secure, and the job of taking it would fall to the 101st Airborne Division. Again, these were not fresh troops. They were men who had already been surrounded, already shelled, already frozen. They had fought through shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They had endured days without relief, nights without sleep, and a winter that punished every weakness. Now, with the siege broken, they were ordered forward once more, not to hold, but to attack. Foy would not be taken quickly. The Germans knew the ground. They occupied stone houses and cellars. Machine guns covered open approaches. Snow offered no concealment. Movement across the fields was visible, exposed, and lethal. Every step forward meant drawing fire from positions that were difficult to spot and harder still to silence. The first assault stalled. Men went down in the open. Units lost cohesion. And momentum bled away under accurate fire. Confusion crept in, not from lack of courage, but from exhaustion and the brutal clarity of the terrain. Foy demanded leadership at the smallest level. Squad leaders, platoon commanders, individual decisions made under fire, where hesitation meant death. When the attack renewed, it did so with grim determination. Paratroopers moved house to house. Grenades shattered rooms. Rifles fired at distances measured in steps, not yards. This was not the sweeping movement of armor or artillery. This was infantry combat stripped down to its core. Men advancing through snow, smoke, and shattered buildings, knowing the enemy was waiting behind every wall. By the time Foy finally fell, the cost was unmistakable. The village was wrecked. The snow was churned into mud and blood. The men who took it were changed. But with Foy secured, the threat to Bastogne finally lifted. The line stabilized. The Bulge began to collapse back on itself. What had been a desperate defensive stand turned into the beginning of an Allied counter-offensive. The Battle of Foy matters not because of its size. It matters because it shows what war looks like after the crisis passes, when exhausted soldiers are still asked to advance, when victory depends not on fresh strength, but on endurance pushed beyond reason. It reveals the cost of winter fighting, the strain of repeated combat, the quiet heroism of men who move forward because there is no other option. Foy was not taken by spectacle or surprise. It was taken by persistence. Tonight, we return to that frozen village, to the fields without cover, to the streets fought over room by room, to the moment when the men of the 101 pushed forward one last time in the snow. This is the story of the 101st Airborne at Foy. And before we continue, I want to speak to you directly. If you're still here listening closely, if these long, calm journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or feel grounded at the end of the day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. Subscribing doesn't just support the channel. It keeps this kind of patient, immersive storytelling alive. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of the 101st Airborne at Foy. January 13th, 1945, 0900 hours. Private James Campbell pressed his body against frozen earth and watched his breath crystallize in the air above his foxhole. Across 400 meters of snow-covered Belgian farmland, the village of Foy sat perched on its low ridge like a fortress from another century. Church steeple rising above stone buildings, smoke drifting from chimneys where German soldiers warmed themselves, bodies from the previous assault still visible in the snow, dark shapes that nobody talked about. Campbell had arrived at the front 72 hours earlier, a replacement fresh from England, and now officers were telling him to cross that killing ground and take that town. He was 19 years old. He had never fired his rifle at another human being. In 90 minutes, he would be dead. But rewind 5 weeks. December 19th, 1944, when Foy was just a name on a map, a cluster of perhaps 40 buildings housing 250 Belgian civilians who'd survived 4 years of German occupation. Allied intelligence officers studying aerial reconnaissance photographs paid it little attention initially. The town controlled a junction where the N30 highway intersected with a smaller road, the N843, connecting Bastogne to the northeast. Nothing strategic, nothing worth dying for, except the photographs revealed something the maps couldn't show: elevation. Foy sat 20 meters higher than the surrounding terrain, and its church steeple offered 360-degree observation of every approach road, every tree line, every movement across miles of open country. Whoever held that steeple controlled the battlefield, and by December 19th, German forces flooding westward in their desperate Ardennes offensive had recognized what Allied planners had missed. The men of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, first heard the name Foy in whispers and rumors as they dug defensive positions in the frozen woods north of Bastogne. These were America's elite paratroopers, soldiers who jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through hedgerows in France, survived the disaster of Operation Market Garden in Holland. They were exhausted, they were under strength, they were supposed to be resting at Camp Mourmelon in France, sleeping in real beds, eating hot food, recovering from 3 months of continuous combat. Instead, on December 17th, emergency orders had sent them racing toward Belgium in open trucks through freezing rain. A routine defensive assignment, officers said. Maybe 3 days. Pack light. They'd left their winter gear behind, left their heavy weapons behind, left any illusion of rest behind. By December 20th, when the 101st Airborne established its perimeter around Bastogne, Easy Company numbered 64 combat-effective soldiers. They should have been 139. The missing weren't dead. Well, some were dead, but most were wounded, scattered across field hospitals in England and France, men whose bodies had been broken by bullets and shrapnel and the simple arithmetic of sustained combat. The 64 who remained now held a section of line in woods called Bois Jacques, staring across open ground toward Foy. They could see German soldiers moving through the village, could see machine gun positions being established, could see their own future being prepared in those stone buildings. And they understood, with the clarity that comes from experience, that someone would eventually order them to cross that open ground and take that town. Temperature on January 13th, -8 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, rising to perhaps 5 degrees by mid-morning. Easy Company had been living in foxholes for 25 days. Trenchfoot had claimed more men than German bullets in some platoons. Frostbite turned fingers black, toes gangrenous. Men urinated on their hands to warm them enough to pull triggers. They ate rations frozen solid, chocolate bars that could break teeth. They slept in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, because sleeping longer in that cold meant not waking up. Their wool uniforms, designed for temperate climates, provided almost no insulation. Their boots, ordinary leather combat boots without insulation, were catastrophically inadequate. The Army had winter equipment, insulated boots, heavy parkas, thermal underwear, but that equipment was in warehouses in England and France, part of supply chains that couldn't adapt to sudden German offensives. The contemporary footage of Foy today shows a peaceful Belgian village, neat houses with flower boxes, paved roads. A monument to Easy Company stands near the church, placed there in 2004, with the names of the dead engraved in bronze. Tourists visit, they take photographs, they stand in the exact spots where men died, and try to imagine what it was like. But imagination fails. Standing in summer sunshine or gentle spring rain, it's impossible to comprehend what that landscape meant in January 1945. Impossible to understand how 400 meters of open ground could be a death sentence. Impossible to feel the cold that turned living tissue into dead meat, the hunger that made men's hands shake, the exhaustion that made conscious thought feel like wading through deep water. Intelligence reports from January 9th identified Foy's defenders as elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced by remnants of other units shattered in earlier fighting. Perhaps 280 to 320 combat-effective German soldiers held the town, spread across a defensive network that converted every building into a strongpoint. They had machine guns, they had mortars, they had 88mm anti-tank guns positioned to fire down the approach routes. They had pre-registered artillery coordinates covering every avenue of attack, meaning German gunners kilometers away could drop high explosive shells onto specific grid squares within seconds of receiving radio calls. Most importantly, they had motivation. These weren't the confident Wehrmacht troops of 1940 who'd blitzkrieged across France. These were desperate men fighting on their last reserves of fanaticism and fear, knowing that every day they delayed the Allied advance was another day for Germany to organize new defenses, to build new weapons, to hope for political miracles. Easy Company's strength on the morning of January 13th, 64 men present for duty. 41% were replacements who'd arrived after Normandy, some within the past 2 weeks. They didn't know the veterans' names, hadn't trained with them, didn't share the bonds forged through shared combat. 59% were veterans, men who jumped into Normandy 7 months earlier, but those 7 months had compressed lifetimes of experience into bodies still young. Average age of veterans, 23.7 years. Average age of replacements, 19.2 years. The youngest soldier preparing to assault Foy was 18, the oldest was 31, ancient by airborne standards. Each man carried an M1 Garand rifle, 80 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, 1 K ration, total combat load, 45 pounds. Not counting the weight of fear, the orders came down through channels the way orders always do. Regiment to battalion, battalion to company, company to platoon. By the time they reached the men actually expected to execute them, the strategic reasoning had been stripped away, leaving only the essential task, take Foy. No explanation of why Foy mattered. No assurance that support would be adequate. No acknowledgement that the first assault, 4 days earlier on January 9th, had failed catastrophically with 23 men killed and 67 wounded. Just the order. And the knowledge, unspoken but universal among the men in those frozen foxholes, that some of them, many of them, would not survive the next 2 hours. James Campbell, the replacement who'd arrived 72 hours earlier, had written a letter home the previous night. His last letter, though he didn't know it, the letter talked about the cold, about how different Belgium was from his hometown in Pennsylvania, about the other soldiers, the veterans who seemed so much older than their actual ages. The letter is preserved now in the National Archives, part of a collection of correspondence from soldiers who died in the Battle of the Bulge. It ends mid-sentence, as if Campbell had been interrupted or simply run out of things to say. I suppose when this is over we'll all go home and try to forget, but I don't think I'll ever forget the cold or the waiting. Or, the sentence doesn't finish. Perhaps he meant to return to it later. Perhaps he couldn't find words for what he wanted to express. 72 hours later, he was dead in the snow, 400 meters from where he'd written those words. And the letter was mailed anyway, arriving at his mother's house 3 weeks after the telegram informing her of his death. December 17, 1944, 2030 hours, Kampfgruppe of 30 hours. Kampfgruppe Genoul in France. Lieutenant Dick Winters stood in the doorway of the barracks and watched his men scramble to pack equipment they didn't understand they'd need. The alert had come down 2 hours earlier. Prepare for immediate deployment. Location classified. Duration unknown. Officers knew slightly more than enlisted men, which is to say they knew almost nothing. Something happening in Belgium. German counteroffensive. Situation fluid. The 101st Airborne would deploy to establish blocking positions, while conventional infantry units organized proper response. Routine defensive work, maybe 3 days, a week at most, so the men packed for 3 days. Left their heavy winter coats in storage, left their insulated sleeping bags, left everything that seemed unnecessary for a brief deployment in December weather. They'd regret these decisions within 48 hours, but standing in the relative warmth of French barracks, nobody imagined what was coming. The fundamental doctrine of airborne forces, developed through hard experience in North Africa and Europe, specified clear operational parameters. Airborne units were shock troops, light infantry designed to be dropped behind enemy lines, seize critical objectives, create chaos and disruption, then be relieved by conventional forces within 48 to 72 hours. They traveled light because they jumped from airplanes. They hit hard because surprise compensated for lack of heavy weapons. They withdrew or were relieved quickly because they couldn't sustain extended combat against armored or heavily equipped enemies. The entire concept depended on speed, surprise, and short duration. You didn't use paratroopers to hold static defensive lines. You didn't commit them to extended campaigns. You certainly didn't deploy them without proper equipment and expect them to survive winter warfare. But doctrine collides with reality. and in December 1944, Allied High Command had no choice but to violate every principle of airborne employment. The German Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16th with 3 armies and 250,000 men, had torn a 50-mile gap in American lines. Conventional infantry divisions were scattered, surrounded, or in full retreat. Armored divisions were rushing toward the breakthrough but needed time to organize. The only immediately available units were the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting at Camp Moermelan after 2 months of combat in Holland. So doctrine was abandoned. The paratroopers would deploy not for a lightning raid, but for sustained defensive combat. Not for 48 hours, but for an indefinite period. Not with adequate preparation, but with whatever they could grab in 2 hours of chaotic packing. The convoy that left Camp Moermelan on December 18th carried 11,840 men of the 101st Airborne Division. They rode in open trucks through freezing rain that turned to sleet, then snow. No winter clothing. Inadequate ammunition stocks, 4 days' worth for an estimated 3-day mission, which seemed reasonable until you considered that estimates in warfare are notoriously unreliable. The division carried roughly 60% of its authorized heavy weapons. Missing were most of the division's anti-tank guns, heavy mortars, and engineering equipment, all of which had been left behind in Holland or England. The trucks themselves were borrowed from supply units, driven by drivers who didn't know the routes, navigating roads clogged with refugees fleeing westward, and scattered American units retreating eastward. Men in those trucks watched the refugee columns with growing unease. This wasn't the France they'd liberated in summer, where civilians cheered and threw flowers. These were terrified people abandoning homes with whatever possessions they could carry. Old men, women, children, pushing carts, pulling wagons, faces blank with shock, and mixed among the refugees, American soldiers. Not organized units conducting tactical withdrawals, but individuals and small groups who'd been separated from their formations. Some still carried weapons. Some had abandoned everything except the need to move away from whatever was happening to the east. The veterans in those trucks, men who'd seen combat in Normandy and Holland, recognized something in those faces. Defeat, rout, the kind of disintegration that happens when military units break psychologically, when the command structure dissolves and survival instinct overrides discipline. December 19th, late afternoon. The 101st Airborne reached the outskirts of Bastogne and received orders that made clear this would be nothing like what they'd been told. They wouldn't be establishing blocking positions. They would be defending Bastogne itself, a critical road junction that German forces intended to capture to maintain momentum of their offensive. The perimeter they needed to hold stretched 16 miles. 16 miles for a division designed to hold perhaps 4 miles maximum in its designated role. The math was simple and terrible. They'd be spread impossibly thin, covering frontage that doctrine said required at least 3 divisions, and they'd be doing it without the heavy weapons, artillery support, or resupply capabilities that made such defensive missions feasible. Easy Company drew its sector in woods north of Bastogne, facing toward the village of Foy. Their orders were specific: establish defensive positions, patrol aggressively, prevent German penetration. What the orders didn't mention, because everyone understood without saying, you're on your own. No reinforcements available. Limited artillery support due to ammunition shortages. Resupply dependent on airdrops that might or might not come. The 101st was being asked to perform a mission fundamentally incompatible with its design, training, and equipment. It would be like using a sports car for off-road racing, then blaming the car when it broke down. Except the car in this analogy was made of human beings who would die when the inevitable breakdown occurred. The first nights in those positions revealed the full scope of the disaster. Temperatures dropped into the teens Fahrenheit, then lower. The ground was frozen solid, 18 inches down, making digging proper foxholes nearly impossible. Men chipped at frozen earth with entrenching tools until their hands bled, managed to scrape shallow depressions that provided minimal protection. No sleeping bags. No insulated clothing. Men huddled together for warmth, 2 or 3 to a foxhole, taking turns sleeping and standing guard. Frost formed on their uniforms. Ice crusted their helmets. They heated rations over tiny fires using scraps of wood and cardboard, knowing the smoke might draw artillery, but unable to function without occasional hot food. By December 20th, the encirclement was complete. German forces had bypassed Bastogne to the north and south, cutting all roads. The 101st Airborne was surrounded, 11,840 men, plus attached armor and artillery units, plus 4,000 Bastogne civilians who hadn't evacuated. Total encircled, approximately 15,000 soldiers and 4,000 civilians, dependent on supplies that would have to come by air, if they came at all. The situation had transformed from routine defensive assignment to desperate siege within 72 hours, and the men digging those frozen foxholes understood that nobody was coming to relieve them. The only way out was through. December 22nd, 1100 hours. German commanders sent a delegation under white flag to demand surrender. The terms were straightforward: immediate capitulation or total destruction. The American response, delivered by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, has become legendary. Nuts. One word, defiant, quotable, perfect for newspapers and history books. But what that response meant for the men in the foxholes was simpler and grimmer: keep fighting, keep holding, keep dying if necessary. Because surrender wasn't an option, relief wasn't coming soon, and the only strategy was to endure whatever the Germans and the weather inflicted until something changed. The men of Easy Company, staring across snow-covered fields toward Foy, heard about McAuliffe's response and understood it wasn't bravado. It was a death sentence with uncertain timing. December 22nd, 1944, 1400 hours. German forward command post, 2 kilometers east of Foy. Major Hans Schmidt spread the map across his improvised desk and traced road networks with one finger, while his staff officers watched. The map showed Bastogne at center, surrounded by German positions, with multiple roads radiating outward like spokes from a wheel hub. Schmidt's finger stopped at Foy, a tiny dot northeast of Bastogne where 2 roads intersected. To American planners studying similar maps, Foy was insignificant. To Schmidt, who understood how sieges worked, who'd studied the ground personally, who'd climbed that church steeple and looked through binoculars at the surrounding terrain, Foy was everything. Control Foy, control observation, control observation, control artillery, control artillery, control the battlefield. It was that simple. The science of military geography reduces complex landscapes to essential elements: elevation, fields of fire, avenues of approach, key terrain. Foy possessed all 4 in abundance. The town sat on a low ridge, elevation 425 meters above sea level, 20 meters higher than the woods to the south where American paratroopers dug their positions. 20 meters doesn't sound significant. 20 meters is the height of a 6-story building. But in flat Belgian farmland, 20 meters of elevation transformed Foy from village to fortress. From that ridge, observers could see movement 3 to 5 kilometers in multiple directions. They could watch American supply trucks approaching Bastogne from the west, could track troop movements, could direct artillery fire onto targets that would be invisible from ground level. The church steeple amplified this advantage exponentially. Constructed in the 18th century, the steeple rose 15 meters above the town's highest roofline, adding another layer of observation. German forward observers installed in that steeple, with binoculars, map coordinates, and radio communication to artillery batteries, could observe nearly the entire southern approach to Bastogne. Every American movement became visible. Every concentration of troops drew artillery fire. Every supply convoy risked destruction. Allied intelligence officers analyzing casualty patterns during the siege later estimated that observation from Foy directed artillery fire responsible for 30% of American casualties in the southern sector. One church steeple, 30% of casualties. That's the mathematics of elevation. But Foy's value extended beyond observation. The road junction it controlled, N30 highway running northeast toward Hoffelais and N843, connecting east-west, represented one of only 3 improved roads in the sector capable of handling heavy military traffic. The other roads were dirt tracks that December rain and January snow had transformed into impassable mud. For German forces trying to maintain supply lines to units pushing westward, those improved roads were lifelines. For American forces trying to relieve Bastogne once Patton's armor broke through from the south, those same roads were essential. Whoever controlled Foy controlled movement throughout the sector. German defensive doctrine, refined through 5 years of war on multiple fronts, emphasized converting villages into strongpoints. The process was systematic and brutal. Combat engineers surveyed every building for defensive potential. Stone structures with thick walls became machine gun positions. Houses on the perimeter received reinforced firing positions, cut through walls at ground level. Interior walls were breached to create covered passages allowing defenders to move between buildings without exposing themselves to fire. Basements became ammunition storage and casualty collection points. The strongest building, usually the church, became the command post and final fallback position. Fields of fire were cleared by demolishing buildings that obstructed sight lines. By early January 1945, Foy had been transformed according to this doctrine. German engineers had created 12 fortified buildings, each with interlocking fields of fire covering the approaches. 8 machine gun nests were positioned to provide overlapping coverage. If attackers suppressed one, the others could still engage them. 3 anti-tank gun positions covered the main approach routes. Their 88mm guns capable of destroying not just tanks but also any building American troops might use for cover. 1 mortar pit, carefully camouflaged, could drop high explosive shells onto attackers who thought they'd reached covered positions. And surrounding the entire defensive network, minefields. Approximately 180 screw mines, small anti-personnel devices designed to maim rather than kill, buried in patterns that would channel attackers into kill zones. 40 teller mines, larger anti-tank weapons that would destroy vehicles and obliterate anyone nearby. The defenders themselves represented a cross-section of the Wehrmacht's declining fortunes. German units in the Ardennes offensive, mixed elite formations with hastily assembled Volksgrenadier divisions, People's Infantry, composed of older men, young boys, and recovered wounded pressed back into service. The troops holding Foy came from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, reinforced by stragglers from other units. They weren't the supermen of Nazi propaganda, average age 32 years, significantly older than their American opponents. Physical condition, adequate to poor, many suffering from inadequate rations and the same cold that afflicted Americans. Training variable, with some veterans of the Eastern Front mixed among boys who'd received perhaps 8 weeks of basic instruction. But what they lacked in youth and training, they compensated with desperation and defensive advantage. These men understood they were fighting on German territory. Belgium had been occupied German territory for 4 years, administratively incorporated into the Reich. They'd been told Allied forces would commit atrocities against German soldiers. Whether they believed this varied individually, but it provided motivation beyond simple military duty. More concretely, they knew that retreat meant court-martial or execution. SS security units behind the lines had orders to shoot deserters and defeatists. The choice was simple: fight from prepared positions or die retreating from them. American intelligence officers, conducting prisoner interrogations and analyzing captured documents after Foy's fall, reconstructed the defensive commander's briefing to his troops. The briefing emphasized that Foy was vital ground that must be held regardless of cost. It specified that no withdrawal would be permitted without explicit orders from division level. It promised that artillery support would be immediate and massive in response to any American assault. And it concluded with language borrowed from Hitler's own directives. Every man was expected to fight until death or incapacitation. These weren't suggestions. These were orders backed by the threat of execution, delivered to men who'd already survived years of warfare and understood exactly what defending Foy would require. The tactical situation by January 9th resembled a deadly equation waiting to be solved. In prepared defensive positions, approximately 280 combat-effective German soldiers, with adequate ammunition, excellent observation, predetermined artillery support, and no option to retreat, preparing to assault those positions, approximately 340 American paratroopers, inadequately supplied, exhausted from 3 weeks of siege warfare, without proper reconnaissance of defenses, without adequate artillery support, and under pressure from higher command to take the objective regardless of cost. The equation's solution was predetermined: massive casualties among attackers, probable success if they persisted, and eventual German collapse once defenders expended their ammunition and resolve. The only variable was how many Americans would die solving that equation. December 23, 1944, 0700 hours, easy company positions, Boissejock Woods. Sergeant William Guarnere crouched in his foxhole and watched the sky, listening for aircraft engines. The previous day, German negotiators had demanded surrender. McAuliffe had told them nuts. Fine, defiant, excellent for morale. But defiance doesn't fill empty stomachs or replenish ammunition. An easy company was down to maybe 40 rounds per rifle, 1K ration per man, and no hot food for 3 days. The foxhole he shared with 2 other men had 18 inches of standing water at the bottom from melted snow, and the water was starting to freeze again. His feet hadn't been dry in 4 days. He could feel the numbness spreading from his toes, could feel his boots getting tighter as tissue swelled. Trench foot, the same condition that had crippled armies in the First World War. And now he heard engines. The weather cleared on December 23rd, the first clear skies in 5 days, and the C-47 transport aircraft came in low over Bastogne's perimeter. Cargo doors opened, parachutes blossomed, supply bundles tumbled earthward, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, rations. But German anti-aircraft crews had anticipated this. Flak batteries opened fire, black puffs of explosive shells bracketing the slow-moving transports. Some aircraft were hit, some went down, and the supply bundles, swaying under parachutes, drifted with the wind. Many landed inside the perimeter. Many landed outside, in German-held territory. The Americans watched their supplies drift into enemy hands and understood the mathematics of siege warfare. Every resource that reached the defenders subtracted from resources reaching attackers, but resources landing in no man's land helped nobody. Men volunteered to retrieve bundles that had landed in contested areas. This wasn't heroism in the traditional sense. It was necessity mixed with calculated gambling. A supply bundle might contain ammunition, might contain medical supplies, might contain food that would let them keep fighting another day. So soldiers crawled through snow, through fields where German snipers waited, through zones covered by machine gun fire to drag parachute bundles back to American lines. Some succeeded. Some died trying. The mathematics were brutal but simple. If the bundle contained enough supplies to keep 10 men fighting, and 1 man died retrieving it, the net result was positive from a military accounting perspective. The man who died wouldn't see it that way, but he was dead, and his opinion no longer factored into calculations. Christmas Day 1944. Temperature 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Easy Company received orders to conduct aggressive patrolling toward Foy. The orders came from battalion, which received them from regiment, which received them from division, and nobody at any level seemed to grasp the reality of what aggressive patrolling meant for men who hadn't eaten adequately in a week. Patrols went out anyway, because orders are orders. Small teams, 4 to 6 men, moving through snow-covered woods toward German positions, trying to gather intelligence about enemy strength and dispositions. Some patrols returned with useful information, some returned with casualties, some didn't return at all, disappearing into the frozen landscape, their fates unknown until spring thaws revealed bodies. The cold was its own weapon, more lethal than bullets for men trapped in static positions. Human bodies at rest generate approximately 100 watts of heat, about the same as an incandescent light bulb. That heat dissipates through radiation, conduction, convection. At 12 degrees Fahrenheit, wearing inadequate clothing, sitting in frozen foxholes, the body loses heat faster than it can generate replacement heat. Core temperature drops. Extremities shut down as the body prioritizes vital organs. Fingers become clumsy. Toes go numb. Mental process is slow. Reaction time increases. Soldiers become less effective combatants, not because they lack courage or training, but because their bodies are literally shutting down. Trench foot. The condition that destroyed Goerner's feet and thousands of others develops when feet remain cold and wet for extended periods. The tissue doesn't freeze, it dies. Blood vessels constrict in response to cold, reducing circulation. Cells starve for oxygen. Tissue begins to necrotize, turning white, then blue, then black. The condition is agonizingly painful in early stages as nerves die. Later it becomes numb, which is worse because numbness means irreversible damage. Treatment in 1944. Remove the soldier from cold environment. Rewarm the feet gradually. Sometimes amputate damaged tissue. Prevention. Keep feet dry and warm. Easy solution in theory. Impossible in practice when you're living in a frozen foxhole with water at the bottom and no dry socks. Medical personnel attached to the 101st Airborne treated approximately 600 cases of frostbite and trench foot during the Bastogne siege. That number represents only severe cases requiring evacuation or immediate treatment. It doesn't count the hundreds more suffering minor frostbite, the men who lost fingertips or toes but remained with their units because evacuation resources were reserved for life-threatening injuries. And it doesn't count the psychological cases, the men whose minds broke under the combination of cold, hunger, shelling, and sustained fear. Those men were often reclassified as battle fatigue and treated, if treated at all, with a few days' rest before being returned to their units. December 26th, 1500 hours. Men in Easy Company's positions heard sounds from the west that they'd been waiting for: tank engines, artillery firing, the low rumble of heavy combat. Patton's Third Army had broken through German encirclement from the south, opening a narrow corridor into Bastogne. Relief had arrived, the siege was lifted. Except it wasn't, not really. The corridor was only a few hundred meters wide, under constant German artillery fire, and barely passable for supply vehicles. More importantly, instead of being evacuated, the 101st received new orders: expand the perimeter, attack outward to widen the corridor, which meant that men who'd survived 3 weeks of siege, who were at the edge of physical and mental collapse, were now expected to go on the offensive. January 1st, 1945, New Year's Day, in peacetime, a day for celebration and reflection. In the foxholes north of Bastogne, just another day of frozen misery. Someone had managed to obtain a bottle of cognac. How? Nobody asked, because military supply systems work in mysterious ways. And it was passed around. Each man took a small sip, enough to warm the throat for a few seconds, then passed it on. Someone tried to sing Auld Lang Syne. The song died after a few lines because nobody could remember the words, and nobody had energy for the performance. Instead, they sat in silence, watching snowfall, watching the distant lights of Foy, knowing that sooner or later they'd receive orders to go get that town. The official casualty figures for the 101st Airborne during the Bastogne siege: 482 killed, 2,449 wounded, approximately 200 missing. Those numbers don't include the frostbite cases, don't include the men who broke psychologically, don't include the long-term health consequences for survivors. They're just the immediate, documentable military losses. But even those official numbers tell a story. The 101st had lost roughly 23% of its effective strength in 3 weeks of defensive operations. That's nearly 1 in 4 soldiers dead, wounded, or missing. And the division's hardest fighting, the assault on Foy, was still ahead. The men who would attack Foy on January 13th weren't the fresh troops doctrine assumed for offensive operations. They were survivors. They'd been broken by cold and hunger and fear, then hardened by the simple fact of survival. They'd watched friends die, had gone through friends' pockets for cigarettes and chocolate, had become intimate with death in ways that people who haven't experienced combat can't understand. They weren't the enthusiastic paratroopers who jumped into Normandy 7 months earlier. They were something harder, more dangerous, and more fragile. They were men who'd learned that survival sometimes requires doing terrible things, and who understood that the next terrible thing they'd be asked to do was cross 400 meters of open ground under machine gun fire to kill Germans in a town they'd never heard of before this campaign. December 27th, 1944, 0800 hours. Foy Village Center. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker supervised 4 men dragging furniture from a Belgian farmhouse and stacking it against the interior walls. The furniture, heavy wooden tables, chairs, a wardrobe that had probably been in someone's family for generations, would provide additional protection against small arms fire once the shooting started. Becker's orders were specific: convert every building in Foy into a defensible position. Every window became a firing port, every doorway a potential kill zone, every basement a shelter for wounded and ammunition storage. This wasn't Becker's first defensive position. He'd fought in Russia, watched the Wehrmacht retreat across Ukraine while conducting similar conversions of villages into fortresses. He knew how this worked. The building materials didn't matter. Russian wood, Belgian stone, it was all the same when bullets started flying. What mattered was creating overlapping fields of fire and interior protection. German defensive doctrine had been refined through catastrophic experience on the Eastern Front, where Red Army human wave assaults had taught Wehrmacht officers exactly how to maximize casualties among attackers. The core principle: defense in depth with interlocking fields of fire. Each defensive position had to support adjacent positions, creating zones where attackers faced fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Buildings were positioned so that machine guns in one structure could cover the approaches to neighboring structures. Anti-tank guns were sighted to fire down the length of streets, creating enfilade fire that would catch attackers in the open. Mortar positions were located centrally, able to drop shells onto any area of the village, while remaining concealed from direct fire. By January 2nd, Foy had been transformed according to these principles. Engineers had created 12 fortified strongpoints from the village's sturdiest buildings. Each strongpoint had multiple firing positions, reinforced walls, and cleared fields of fire. The positioning wasn't random. If you mapped the strongpoints and drew lines representing machine gun fields of fire, you'd see that every approach to Foy was covered by at least 2, usually 3 machine gun positions. An attacker advancing from the south, the most likely direction given American positions, would immediately come under fire from positions on Foy's southern edge. If he tried to flank left or right, he'd be engaged by positions on the eastern and western edges. If he somehow reached the buildings, interior positions would fire from second-story windows and prepared loopholes. The crown jewel of Foy's defense was the church. Stone construction, walls nearly a meter thick, tower providing 360-degree observation. German engineers had reinforced the ground floor with sandbags and wooden beams, creating a shelter that could withstand anything short of direct artillery hits. The tower served multiple functions: observation post, radio antenna mounting point, and psychological symbol. Churches in European villages typically stood as the tallest structures, visible for kilometers. Soldiers approaching Foy would see that church steeple dominating the skyline and understand they were attacking a defended position. The psychological impact of attacking a fortified church, a building associated with sanctuary and safety, subtly reinforced the sense of attacking an impregnable fortress. Anti-tank guns positioned around Foy represented a lethal surprise for any American armor support. The 88mm gun was Germany's premier anti-tank weapon, originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, but adapted for ground combat when its effectiveness against tanks was discovered. The 88 could penetrate virtually any Allied tank's armor at ranges up to 2,000 meters. But in Foy's defensive scheme, the guns weren't primarily aimed at tanks. They were positioned to fire down approach routes, their high-explosive shells capable of demolishing buildings, destroying vehicle cover, and creating catastrophic casualties among infantry. 3 88mm guns, carefully camouflaged, covered the 3 main approaches to Foy. Crews had pre-registered range markers, so they could fire accurately without needing to adjust sights. Minefields represented the defensive position's outer ring, creating obstacles that would slow attackers and channel them into predetermined kill zones. German combat engineers had laid approximately 180 shoe mines, small wooden-cased anti-personnel mines that Allied metal detectors couldn't locate. Each shoe mine contained just enough explosive to blow off a foot or shatter a leg. They weren't designed to kill outright, but to maim, creating casualties that would require multiple soldiers to evacuate and medical resources to treat. The logic was grimly efficient. A killed soldier removed one enemy from the battlefield, but a wounded soldier screaming for medics removed the wounded man, plus however many comrades came to his aid, plus the medics treating him, plus the resources devoted to evacuation and treatment. 40 teller mines supplemented the shoe mines, positioned along likely vehicle approaches. Each teller mine contained 5 kilograms of explosive, sufficient to destroy a truck or tank. More importantly, a teller mine detonation in an infantry formation would kill or wound everyone within a 5 to 10 meter radius. Shockwaves would shatter eardrums, collapse lungs, create traumatic brain injuries, even among men who appeared physically unharmed. Shrapnel would cut down anyone farther away. And the psychological impact of watching fellow soldiers disintegrate in an explosion would shake even veteran units. The German defenders themselves, approximately 280 combat-effective soldiers, came from depleted units consolidated to create a viable fighting force. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division had been shattered in earlier fighting, losing perhaps 60% of its original strength. Survivors were combined with stragglers from other units, recovered wounded, returned to duty, and even a few Luftwaffe ground personnel whose air bases had been overrun. This mixing of units from different services and backgrounds should theoretically have reduced combat effectiveness. Cohesion matters in military units. Soldiers who've trained together, who know each other's capabilities, who've developed informal communication networks, fight more effectively than scratch units composed of strangers. But Foy's defensive situation compensated for the defenders' lack of cohesion. In offensive operations, units need coordination, communication, and synchronized movement. In static defense from prepared positions, requirements are simpler. Know your field of fire, conserve ammunition, don't retreat until ordered. Even poorly trained soldiers can execute these tasks adequately when they're protected by stone walls, armed with machine guns, and motivated by fear of what happens if they fail. And the Foy defenders had strong motivation. SS security units, operating behind German lines, had made clear that defeatism and cowardice were capital offenses. There were only two acceptable outcomes: hold Foy or die holding it. Artillery support had been pre-planned with Germanic precision. German artillery doctrine emphasized preparatory fire planning, creating predetermined target zones with pre-calculated firing data. Forward observers in Foy's church steeple had mapped 27 target zones covering all approaches and assembly areas. Each target zone had a designation: Anton 1, Bruno 3, etc., and corresponding firing data was already recorded at artillery battery positions, kilometers to the east. When American attack developed, the observer would simply radio "Fire Anton 1," and shells would land on that grid square within 30 to 45 seconds. No ranging required, no adjustment necessary, just immediate, accurate fire on attackers who thought they'd found safe positions. The defensive preparations weren't perfect. Ammunition stocks were adequate but not abundant. Perhaps 200 rounds per rifle, 3,000 rounds per machine gun, 30 to 40 shells per anti-tank gun. Food was limited, with defenders on reduced rations similar to American levels. Medical supplies were minimal, with one aid station in the church basement staffed by 2 medics. Communications relied on radio sets, whose batteries were failing, and wire lines that Allied artillery could cut. The positions lacked overhead cover in most locations, leaving defenders vulnerable to artillery and mortar fire. But perfection wasn't necessary. The defense only needed to inflict enough casualties to stop the attack, and the combination of prepared positions, interlocking fire, and desperation provided reasonable confidence that initial assaults would fail. January 12, 1945, 2100 hours. Easy company positions. Bois Jacques Woods. Private David Webster sat with his back against frozen dirt and tried to write a letter by the light of a carefully shielded candle. His hands shook not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from cold and exhaustion that made fine motor control nearly impossible. The pencil kept slipping from fingers that no longer had full sensation. He was 22 years old, a college student before the war, someone who'd volunteered for the paratroopers because it seemed adventurous, and because elite units attracted a certain kind of young man who believed himself capable of extraordinary things. 7 months and 3 combat jumps later, he understood that adventure was a word people used when they'd never experienced the reality of trying to kill other human beings while they tried to kill you. The 64 men who would assault Foy the next morning represented a cross-section of American society compressed into one understrength rifle company. 41% were replacements, who'd arrived after D-Day, some within the past 2 weeks. They came from replacement depots in England, young men barely out of basic training, shipped forward to fill the gaps left by casualties. They didn't know the veterans' names, hadn't shared their experiences, lacked the informal networks of trust that make military units function. They were strangers inserted into a family, expected to perform at the same level as men who'd survived months of combat together. Some would adapt, some would freeze, some would die before having the chance to prove themselves either way. Sergeant Denver "Bull" Randleman represented the other 59%, the veterans. He jumped into Normandy on June 6th, fought through the hedgerows, survived Operation Market Garden in Holland, and somehow remained alive and functional when half his original squad was dead or evacuated wounded. He was 31 years old, ancient by airborne standards, a North Carolina native whose pre-war experience had been manual labor and whose wartime experience had been killing, not combat. Killing. There's a difference. Combat is the abstract concept. Killing is the specific act of ending another person's existence, and Randleman had done enough of it to understand exactly what would happen tomorrow when they crossed that open ground toward Foy. The company's demographics told a story of attrition and replacement that characterized American forces in the European theater by January 1945. Average age among veterans, 23.7 years. Average age among replacements, 19.2. The youngest soldier preparing for the assault was 18, so young that he'd required parental permission to enlist. The oldest was 33, a former National Guard officer who'd been busted back to private for reasons nobody discussed. Combat experience ranged from 0 days for the newest replacement to 214 days for men who'd been with Easy Company since Normandy. That's a 7-month spread of experience compressed into one tactical unit, like trying to field a basketball team where half the players had never touched a ball before. Equipment checks were automatic, ritualistic, comforting in their routine. Men 1 Garand rifle, 8-round internal magazine, semi-automatic fire, reliable if kept clean. Webster checked his rifle's action, cycling the bolt to ensure smooth operation in the cold. 80 rounds of ammunition distributed in cloth bandoliers. 10 8-round clips, 2 Mark II fragmentation grenades, the pineapple-shaped explosives that weighed about 1.5 pounds each and would kill anyone within a 5-meter radius if they exploded in the open. 1K ration, the boxed meal containing crackers, canned meat, chocolate bar, and cigarettes. 1 canteen of water, though the water had frozen hours ago and was now a useless block of ice. Total combat load, 45 pounds of equipment that had to be carried across 400 meters of snow while people shot at you. Private First Class Joseph Liebgott sharpened his knife with methodical strokes of a whetstone, the scraping sound barely audible above the wind. The knife was technically unnecessary. Bayonets served the same function, but many soldiers carried personal knives for reasons that range from practical to psychological. Liebgott was a Jewish soldier who'd grown up in San Francisco, fluent in German due to immigrant parents, often used as an interrogator when prisoners needed questioning. He'd seen photographs from liberated concentration camps, knew what was being done to his people in occupied Europe, carried a hatred that went beyond normal military animosity. The knife wasn't just a tool, it was a promise. Staff Sergeant Carwood Lipton, Easy Company's senior NCO, moved from position to position, conducting his own inspection of men and equipment. Lipton was 24, impossibly young for the responsibility he carried, but combat has a way of sorting people into those who can lead and those who can't. He'd been promoted through field vacancies. The previous first sergeant had been killed, the one before that wounded, until by process of elimination and demonstrated competence, Lipton found himself as the senior enlisted man in a company that had lost more than half its original strength. He checked each man's ammunition, inspected weapons, offered quiet words that were neither false encouragement nor grim fatalism, just acknowledgement that tomorrow would be bad and they'd have to do it anyway. The replacements were easy to identify, even in darkness. They moved differently, talked differently, carried their equipment differently. Veteran soldiers developed economy of movement, an efficiency born from understanding what mattered and what didn't. Replacements fussed with their gear, adjusted straps, checked and rechecked equipment with the nervous energy of men who'd been taught procedure but hadn't internalized it through experience. Some veterans helped them, showing them how to arrange ammunition for quick access, how to tape down anything that rattled, how to carry grenades so they'd be immediately available. Other veterans ignored them, not from cruelty, but from the superstitious belief that getting to know replacements was pointless, since many wouldn't survive their first action. Private Albert Blythe represented a category between veteran and replacement, a soldier who'd fought in Normandy but had broken psychologically and been evacuated with hysterical blindness, a psychosomatic condition where combat stress caused temporary vision loss. He'd recovered, been returned to duty, and now prepared for his second major action, carrying the knowledge that his mind had failed him once before. Would it fail again? He didn't know. Nobody knew. But the question sat in his consciousness like a tumor, growing larger as the hours until assault counted down. Medic Eugene Rowe made his own preparations, checking aid bags that represented the difference between dying in the snow and surviving long enough to reach a field hospital. Morphine syrettes, small tubes of pain medication topped with needles that could be jammed through clothing into wounded flesh. Sulfa powder for wounds, the antibiotic that had saved thousands of lives by preventing infection. Bandages, tourniquets, plasma if he could get it, though supplies were critically short. Rowe had treated approximately 40 casualties since Bastogne began, men whose bodies had been torn apart by bullets and shrapnel and who'd screamed for him with their last conscious breath. Tomorrow he'd treat more. How many depended on factors beyond his control, but he prepared as if expecting the worst, because that was the only rational approach. Sergeant Floyd Talbert, another Normandy veteran, conducted his own ritual preparation, writing names and addresses of every man in his squad on a small notepad, so that if he survived and they didn't, he could write their families with personal details that official casualty notifications would lack. The Army sent telegrams. "We regret to inform you. Standard language, bureaucratic, impersonal. But families wanted to know specifics. How did their son die? Did he suffer? Was he afraid? Talbot couldn't answer all those questions honestly. Some truths were too terrible. But he could provide something beyond the telegram's cold formality. So he wrote down names, ages, hometowns, personal details gathered through months of shared foxholes and combat. It was small comfort, but it was something. The night before the assault stretched out with the peculiar temporal distortion of men facing likely death. Minutes felt like hours. Hours disappeared in what seemed like minutes. Some men slept, exhausted bodies overriding anxious minds. Some stayed awake, unable to quiet thoughts spiraling through every possible outcome. Some prayed negotiations with a god they might or might not believe in, promises to be better people if they survived this. Some wrote letters that might or might not be mailed, depending on whether the writer survived to mail them, and some just sat in silence, watching the darkness, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. January 9th, 1945, 0630 hours. Line of departure, 400 meters south of Foy. Lieutenant Fred Haliger checked his watch one final time and raised his hand, the signal to move out. 340 men of 1st Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, rose from their positions in the woods and began advancing across snow-covered farmland toward Foy's. The sun hadn't risen yet. The sky was that pre-dawn gray that turns snow into a colorless expanse where depth perception fails and distances become impossible to judge accurately. Temperature, -12 degrees Fahrenheit. No wind. Silence except for the crunch of boots on frozen crust. For perhaps 90 seconds, it almost seemed like the assault might succeed through surprise and speed. Then the German machine guns opened fire. The distinctive sound of MG-42s, Hitler's buzzsaw, soldiers called them, ripped through the morning quiet at 1,200 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds drew red lines through the gray dawn, and where tracers went, regular bullets followed at 4-to-1 ratio. The Americans had covered maybe 150 meters, still had 250 meters to go, when the first men started falling. Not Hollywood falling, where they clutch their chests and crumple dramatically. Real falling, where a man's legs stop working mid-stride and he face plants into snow, or where impact spins him around and he drops like a puppet with cut strings. The assault had been going for less than 2 minutes, and it was already falling apart. 1st Platoon, leading the advance, went to ground in a drainage ditch that ran roughly parallel to Foy's southern edge. The ditch was perhaps a meter deep, offering concealment but minimal cover. Machine gun fire could still reach men if they raised their heads. Lieutenant Thomas Peacock, 1st Platoon leader, tried to organize return fire, but return fire required targets, and the Germans were shooting from prepared positions inside stone buildings. The Americans could see muzzle flashes, could hear the machine guns, couldn't effectively engage enemies they couldn't properly identify. Peacock called for artillery support, requesting fire missions on the buildings where muzzle flashes originated. Battalion denied the request. Reason: proximity to friendly forces. If artillery overshot or if shells fell short, they'd hit attacking Americans. By 0915 hours, 3 hours into the assault, the mathematics of failure were clear. 1st Battalion had advanced 180 meters maximum, still more than 200 meters from their objective. They'd suffered 23 men killed outright, another 67 wounded with varying degrees of severity. That's 90 casualties from 340 attackers, a 26% casualty rate, and they hadn't even reached the enemy positions yet. Officers called for smoke to conceal movement. The smoke shells arrived, but wind dispersed them before they provided adequate concealment. Officers called for armor support. 2 tank destroyers moved forward, fired several rounds at Foy's buildings, then withdrew when 88mm anti-tank guns engaged them from concealed positions. The fundamental problem was tactical and irreversible. They were attacking uphill across open ground against prepared defensive positions with inadequate support. No amount of courage or training could overcome that equation. The Germans had observation, which meant they could see American movements and direct fire accordingly. They had prepared positions, which meant they could shoot from behind stone walls, while Americans shot from behind snowbanks. They had interlocking fields of fire, which meant suppressing one position just exposed attackers to fire from another position. And they had motivation, the knowledge that SS units behind them would execute anyone who retreated. Individual acts of courage occurred throughout the assault, though courage is perhaps the wrong word. Desperation might be more accurate. Soldiers who realized they were dying in the snow and tried to take some enemy with them. Medics who crawled into machine gun fire to reach wounded men. Squad leaders who tried to rally men forward despite knowing that forward meant death. Staff Sergeant Martin, a Normandy veteran with 2 Bronze Stars, stood up in the drainage ditch and tried to organize a rush toward the nearest building. He made it perhaps 10 meters before multiple machine gun bursts cut him down. His body lay in the snow until dark, when recovery teams could reach it. By 1140 hours, 5 hours into what was supposed to be a rapid assault, Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sink made the decision that should have been made hours earlier: withdraw. The word went out through the chain of command. Platoon leaders informed squad leaders. Squad leaders informed individual soldiers. And the men in that drainage ditch, men who'd been pinned under fire for most of the morning, now faced an equally deadly task: crawling backwards through snow while German machine gunners tried to kill them. You can't run backwards. You can't see where you're going. You move slowly, dragging wounded when possible, and you hope the Germans waste ammunition on men who are withdrawing anyway. The withdrawal cost 11 additional casualties. Men shot while trying to retreat, men who'd been wounded earlier and couldn't move fast enough, men who simply gave up and lay in the snow until capture or death. By 1420 hours, the survivors had made it back to their original positions, and the January 9th assault on Foy was over. Cost: 23 killed, 67 wounded, 11 missing. Gain: 0. The town remained in German hands. The church steeple still provided observation over Allied positions. Nothing had changed except that 90 American families would receive telegrams in 2 to 3 weeks informing them of casualties. After-action reports written by surviving officers attempted to explain the failure in language that wouldn't directly blame higher command for ordering an impossible mission. The reports cited determined enemy resistance and difficult terrain and inadequate artillery support. All technically true, all euphemisms for the underlying reality. They'd been ordered to assault a fortress with light infantry, and light infantry assaulting fortresses get slaughtered. The historical parallel was obvious. The First World War had proven definitively that infantry attacking prepared defensive positions without overwhelming fire support achieved nothing except massive casualties. But apparently those lessons needed relearning in Belgium in January 1945. German casualties in the January 9th assault were estimated at 12 to 15 killed, perhaps 30 wounded. The disparity reveals everything about the tactical situation. Attackers suffered 90 casualties, defenders suffered perhaps 45, 2-to-1 casualty ratio favoring the defense, which is actually relatively modest for assaults on fortified positions. Some World War I battles saw 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 casualty ratios. But the ratio isn't the point. The point is that throwing men at defended positions produces predictable results, and those results were predictable to anyone who studied military history or understood basic tactical mathematics. Evening of January 9th, the survivors dug back into their original foxholes and tried to process what had happened. Some men were angry at Germans, at their officers, at the army, at fate. Some were numb, moving through motions of equipment maintenance and position improvement without conscious thought. Some wept, though crying was something you did quietly in a foxhole so others wouldn't hear. And some simply stared toward Foy, toward the church steeple silhouetted against the evening sky, knowing that they'd be ordered to go back, because the town still mattered strategically, and strategic requirements don't care about tactical impossibilities or human costs. January 10th, 1945, 1900 hours, Battalion Command Post. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sink sat across a makeshift desk from First Lieutenant Norman Dyke and listened to the after-action report from the failed assault. Dyke spoke in the formal language of military briefings, describing enemy positions, fields of fire, casualty figures. His voice was steady, professional, completely devoid of emotion, which was appropriate. Officers were supposed to remain calm under stress. But something about Dyke's presentation troubled Sink. This wasn't calm. This was absence. Like Dyke was describing something that had happened to someone else, some tactical problem from a training exercise rather than a catastrophic failure that had cost 90 men. Norman Dyke had assumed command of Easy Company in November 1944, replacing Captain Richard Winters, who'd been promoted to battalion staff. On paper, Dyke was qualified, Yale graduate, officer candidate school, administrative positions and training commands before requesting combat assignment. He led Easy Company through the Bastogne siege without any major disasters, had conducted himself adequately in defensive operations. But defensive operations and offensive assaults required different leadership qualities, and Sink was beginning to suspect that Dyke possessed the former but not the latter. A competent administrator, an adequate defensive commander, but assaulting fortified positions required something more aggressive, more instinctive, something that couldn't be taught in officer training. The decision to relieve a company commander isn't made lightly. It destroys that officer's career, marks him permanently as someone who failed when it mattered. Sink had commanded men long enough to understand that failures often resulted from impossible situations rather than individual incompetence. But he also understood that companies took on characteristics of their commanders, and Easy Company, under Dyke's leadership, had developed a hesitancy, a by-the-book caution that was appropriate for administration but deadly in combat. The January 9th assault had revealed this clearly. When the attack stalled, Dyke had followed procedures, requested artillery support, called for smoke, reported to battalion, all correct actions. But somewhere in that checklist of correct actions, he'd lost the initiative that separates competent officers from effective combat leaders. January 13th, 0845 hours. Sink called Dyke to battalion headquarters and delivered the news with the directness military culture demands. Dyke was being reassigned to battalion staff, effective immediately, not relieved. Reassigned. The language mattered because relieved for cause would destroy him completely, while reassignment preserved some dignity even if everyone understood what it meant. Dyke accepted the decision without protest, without explanation, without emotion. He saluted, turned, walked out. Sink watched him go and felt the familiar weight of command, the knowledge that he'd just destroyed one man's career to potentially save others' lives, and he'd never know for certain if the decision was correct. First Sergeant Carwood Lipton received notification that command of Easy Company would transfer to First Lieutenant Ronald Spears, currently commanding Dog Company. Lipton's job was to inform the men, to prepare them for the leadership change that would occur literally hours before they assaulted Foy again. He gathered squad leaders and delivered the news in language stripped of politics or judgment. Lieutenant Dyke was being reassigned. Lieutenant Spears would take command. The assault would proceed as planned. Questions were discouraged because there were no answers that wouldn't undermine the mission or the chain of command. Ronald Spears arrived at Easy Company's positions at 0915 hours, 45 minutes before the scheduled assault. He was 25 years old, a combat veteran who'd led Dog Company through Normandy and Holland, with a reputation that mixed competence with something darker. Rumors followed Spears, whispers about prisoners shot in Normandy, about executing one of his own men for cowardice, unsubstantiated stories that might have been true or might have been the kind of legend that accumulates around certain officers. Whether the stories were true mattered less than the fact that men believed them, and belief shaped behavior. Soldiers under Spears' command knew he'd do whatever necessary to accomplish the mission, and that knowledge was both terrifying and oddly comforting. The contrast between Dyke and Spears was stark and immediate. Dyke had commanded through procedures and protocols. Spears commanded through presence. He walked the line of foxholes, not conducting formal inspection, but assessing men with the quick evaluation of someone who'd learned to judge combat readiness at a glance. He asked a few questions: ammunition status, last hot meal, any immediate problems. Brief exchanges, nothing elaborate, but men came away from those exchanges with the sense that Spears understood what they were about to face and wouldn't waste their lives unnecessarily. Whether that assessment was accurate or simply what desperate soldiers wanted to believe, it achieved the necessary effect. They'd follow him. The question of whether Dyke was actually incompetent or simply a scapegoat for an impossible situation has generated decades of historical debate. Interviews with surviving Easy Company members produced mixed responses. Some defended Dyke, noting that he'd performed adequately during the siege and that the January 9th failure resulted from tactical impossibility rather than leadership deficiency. Others were harsh in their assessment, describing Dyke as indecisive and absent when leadership mattered most. The truth, as usual, probably sits somewhere between extremes. Dyke was likely an adequate officer placed in a situation that required exceptional leadership, and adequate wasn't enough. But the relief had consequences beyond Dyke's career. It sent a message through Easy Company and the wider battalion that failure wouldn't be tolerated, that officers who couldn't produce results would be removed regardless of circumstances. This created pressure to take risks, pressure to achieve objectives regardless of cost, pressure to prioritize mission accomplishment over casualty conservation. Some pressure was necessary. Soldiers needed to believe their leaders would do whatever it took to win. But too much pressure produced recklessness, desperate actions that achieved tactical victories at strategic costs. And Easy Company was about to discover exactly where that balance point lay. The command change also revealed something about the wider battalion's desperation. Normally, company commanders were developed over time, promoted from within units that knew them. Bringing in an outside officer hours before a major assault suggested that battalion had no confidence in Easy Company's internal leadership and no time to develop it properly. It was a battlefield expedient, a desperate measure that might work or might catastrophically fail. The men preparing to assault Foy understood this implicitly. They were being led into combat by an officer they didn't know, replacing an officer who'd been declared inadequate, all while preparing to repeat an assault that had already failed once. The psychology of that situation, the doubt, the desperation, the grim determination, shaped everything that would follow. January 13th, 1945, 0930 hours, 400 meters south of Foy. If you stand today in the Bois Jacques woods and look north toward Foy, the terrain seems innocuous. Gentle slope rising perhaps 20 meters over 400 meters of horizontal distance. 5% grade, barely noticeable when walking. Open farmland that in peacetime produces crops. In winter lies beneath snow. Nothing about the landscape screams killing ground. But warfare transforms geography into mathematics, and the mathematics of this particular terrain were absolutely lethal for anyone attempting to cross it under fire. The science of military terrain analysis reduces landscapes to quantifiable factors: observation, fields of fire, avenues of approach, key terrain, obstacles, cover and concealment. Foy and its approaches scored favorably for defenders on every metric. Observation: German positions sat 20 meters higher than American starting positions, providing clear sight lines across the entire approach. Fields of fire: the open farmland offered no natural cover, meaning defending machine guns had unobstructed fire across the full 400 meters. Avenues of approach: only 3 practical routes existed, all of which led directly into prepared German positions. Key terrain: Foy itself controlling the high ground and road junction. Obstacles: snow 18 to 24 inches deep that slowed movement to walking pace. Cover and concealment: none. Modern drone footage following the exact attack route reveals what those statistics meant in practice. The camera lifts from the tree line where American positions were located, moves north across open farmland, and climbs gradually toward Foy's southern buildings. From the drone's perspective, the slope is barely visible, but from a defender's position in Foy looking south, the perspective inverts. The entire approach lies below, spread out like a shooting gallery. Every fold in the terrain that attackers might think provides cover becomes visible from the higher elevation. Every movement across that white expanse becomes immediately obvious. The defensive advantage isn't subtle, it's overwhelming. 1945 aerial reconnaissance photographs preserved in national archives show German defensive positions with stark clarity. Photo interpreters had marked machine gun nests with red crosses, anti-tank gun positions with red circles, likely mortar positions with red triangles. The marks cluster around Foy in patterns that reveal professional defensive planning. Machine gun positions are positioned to provide interlocking fire. If you draw lines representing their fields of fire, you see that every approach is covered by at least 2 positions simultaneously. Anti-tank guns are sighted to fire down the length of natural approach routes, creating enfilade fire that would catch attackers from the side. The mortar pit is centrally located, able to drop shells anywhere in the defensive zone. But aerial photographs can't capture everything. They show the surface, buildings, roads, obvious fortifications. They don't show the interior preparations, the loopholes cut through stone walls at ground level, the internal passages connecting buildings, the pre-registered firing data that allowed defenders to call artillery onto specific grid squares within seconds. American intelligence officers studying those photographs could guess at these preparations based on standard German doctrine, but guessing isn't the same as knowing, and the difference between guessing and knowing would be measured in American casualties. The snow depth, 18 to 24 inches across most of the approach route, transformed what might have been a rapid assault into a slow-motion nightmare. Human beings moving through snow that deep can't run. They can fast walk at best, a kind of high-stepping gait that's exhausting and slow. Average movement speed drops from perhaps 5 miles per hour on clear ground to maybe 2 miles per hour through deep snow. That's 40% normal speed, which means crossing 400 meters takes roughly 4 minutes instead of 90 seconds. 4 minutes of exposure to machine gun fire. 4 minutes during which defenders can shoot at targets moving predictably and slowly. The mathematics are brutal. More time in the kill zone equals more casualties. Veterans who survived the assault describe the experience of crossing that ground in language that's remarkably consistent. The snow made each step an individual effort. You'd lift your leg high to clear the snow depth, plant your foot, sink in, lift the other leg, repeat. Your thighs burned, your lungs burned from breathing frozen air. Your eyes burned from squinting against snow glare and watching for threats. And you couldn't hurry, because hurrying just made you exhaust yourself faster. So you maintained that steady, high-stepping pace while machine gun fire cut through the air around you, and men fell in the snow and kept going because stopping meant dying. The elevation change 20 meters over 400 meters seems minimal until you're running uphill through snow while carrying 45 pounds of equipment and people are shooting at you. 20 meters is about 6 stories. Spread over 400 meters, it's a gentle grade that would be barely noticeable in normal conditions. But combat conditions aren't normal conditions. The physiological cost of moving uphill, even a gentle slope, increases exponentially when combined with snow depth, equipment weight, and the stress hormones flooding your system. Heart rate spikes. Breathing becomes labored. Fine motor control deteriorates. Soldiers who started the assault in peak condition arrived at Foy's buildings completely exhausted, barely capable of executing the complex tasks: room clearing, grenade throwing, aimed rifle fire that house-to-house combat requires. Computer-generated terrain analysis, conducted by military historians using modern digital elevation models, reveals additional factors invisible to period observers. The drainage ditch that 1st Battalion used for cover during the January 9th assault actually channeled soldiers directly into a pre-planned kill zone. From German defensive positions, the ditch appeared as a dark line in the snow, making it obvious where attackers would seek cover. Machine gun positions were deliberately sighted to fire down the length of that ditch, creating an enfilade where bullets traveled parallel to the ditch rather than across it, maximizing casualties. What appeared to attacking Americans as protective terrain was actually a trap prepared by defenders who understood how attackers would instinctively move. Historical comparison places Foy's terrain in context with other failed World War II assaults. Omaha Beach on D-Day featured similar disadvantages, attackers crossing open ground against defenders on high ground. But Omaha Beach assault succeeded through overwhelming firepower, naval gunfire support, and sheer numbers. Foy's assault had none of those advantages. The terrain at Hurtgen Forest provided cover, trees, vegetation, but was equally lethal due to difficulty of movement and excellent German positions. Foy combined the worst of both: open terrain like Omaha Beach, but without support firepower; difficult movement like Hurtgen Forest, but without concealment. The result was predictable to anyone who understood terrain analysis and military history. The ultimate question that terrain analysis poses: could alternative approaches have reduced casualties? Modern staff officers studying the ground have suggested several options. Flank assault from east or west might have avoided some defensive fire, but would have lengthened the approach distance and exposed attackers to positions on Foy's flanks. Night assault might have reduced German observation advantage, but would have made coordination nearly impossible and increased friendly fire risk. Artillery barrage before assault might have suppressed defenders, but ammunition shortages made extensive preparatory fires impossible. Every alternative had drawbacks that possibly exceeded the drawbacks of frontal assault, which means battalion commanders likely chose the least bad option from a menu of bad options, and men died because sometimes least bad is still catastrophically lethal. January 13th, 1945, 0958 hours, 2 minutes to jump off. The men of Easy Company crouched in their foxholes and listened to the silence. No artillery preparation, no smoke screen, no demonstration by other units to divert German attention. Just 64 men preparing to cross 400 meters of open ground and take a fortified village because orders required it. Some prayed, Some checked weapons for the 15th time. Some stared at the ground and tried not to think about what the next 90 minutes would bring. First Sergeant Lipton moved down the line, offering final reminders. Keep interval, watch for German positions, don't bunch up. Professional advice that everyone already knew, but the familiar words provided structure to moments that threatened to dissolve into panic. 1,000 hours. Lieutenant Spears raised his arm and pointed toward Foy, the signal to move. 64 men rose from their positions and began moving north across the snow. The formation was textbook, squad columns with 5 to 7 meters interval between men, enough spacing to prevent one machine gun burst from hitting multiple soldiers. The pace was steady but not rushed. Conservation of energy for the final assault phase. For the first 30 seconds, the advance proceeded exactly as training manuals described. Then the German machine guns opened fire, and training dissolved into survival. Private Webster, advancing with 2nd Squad, saw tracers arcing overhead and went flat in the snow without conscious thought. Training and instinct. Machine gun fire sounds different from rifle fire. Higher rate, more sustained, a tearing noise like fabric ripping. You hear it and you get low, immediately. Because getting low is the difference between a bullet passing overhead and a bullet passing through your skull. He pressed himself into the snow and tried to identify where the fire originated. Muzzle flash from a building on Foy's southern edge. Range maybe 300 meters. The snow around him jumped and sprayed as bullets impacted close enough to throw ice fragments into his face. The assault became a series of disconnected moments, brief images separated by gaps where consciousness couldn't process everything happening. Sergeant Randleman running forward in a crouch, firing his rifle from the hip at targets only he could see. Private Leadgott dragging a wounded replacement toward a slight depression in the terrain, both men leaving blood trails in the snow. Lieutenant Spears standing fully upright, coordinating squad movements, while machine gun fire cut through the air around him. Insane courage or calculated intimidation of his own men. Nobody was certain which. And everywhere the sound. Rifle fire, machine gun fire, the deeper boom of tank destroyer guns firing in support, men screaming for medics, men screaming because pain overrode any attempt at silence. The first casualties came in the opening minutes. Private Campbell, the replacement who'd arrived 72 hours earlier, who'd written that unfinished letter home, took a machine gun burst through the chest at approximately 10:03 hours. He was dead before he hit the snow. No last words, no dramatic final moment, just alive and functional, then not. His body lay where it fell until evening, when Graves' registration teams could retrieve it. By that time he'd frozen solid, one more shape among dozens scattered across the snowfield. His mother would receive her telegram on January 29th. His letter would arrive 3 days later, and she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what he'd meant to say in that unfinished sentence. By 10:12 hours, 12 minutes into the assault, Easy Company had covered roughly 150 meters and taken 14 casualties. The mathematics suggested they'd lose approximately 60% of their strength before reaching Foy. But mathematics don't account for momentum, desperation, or the fact that turning back under fire is often more dangerous than continuing forward. So they continued. Men fell and the assault moved past them. Wounded called for medics. Medics crawled through machine gun fire to reach them. The dead received no attention because the dead don't require medical care, and stopping to check if someone is dead just creates another casualty. The lead elements, 1st Platoon under Lieutenant Peacock, reached Foy's first buildings at approximately 10:25 hours. Reaching the buildings should have provided relief, cover from the machine gun fire that had shredded the assault across open ground. Instead, it presented new horrors. House-to-house fighting, room to room, German defenders behind every wall, firing through prepared loopholes, American soldiers kicking in doors, throwing grenades into rooms, following the grenades with rifle fire, and then their own bodies. Close-range killing, where you saw faces, where you heard men screaming in languages you might or might not understand, where the smoke and dust in confined spaces made everything chaotic and terrifying. Private Blythe, the soldier who'd suffered hysterical blindness in Normandy, advanced through Foy's streets in a state that witnesses later described as mechanical. No hesitation, no fear visible on his face, just methodical movement and shooting. Whether this represented courage or psychological dissociation, nobody could say, but he functioned, which was more than could be said for some others. One replacement, nobody remembered his name afterwards, simply sat down in the middle of the street and refused to move. Not wounded, not physically incapacitated, just unable to continue. Someone dragged him into a building. He survived the battle but was evacuated with combat exhaustion the next day. 1,047 hours. Lieutenant Spears, according to multiple eyewitness accounts, ran directly through Foy from the southern edge to the northern edge, coordinated with dog company forces attacking from that direction, then ran back. The distance was approximately 200 meters each way. German soldiers were still fighting in the buildings he ran past. Machine gun positions were still active. Why he did this? Tactical necessity, personal courage, psychological intimidation of both enemies and his own men remains debated. But the effect was undeniable. Easy Company soldiers saw their commander do something insane and survive, and it reinforced the belief that perhaps they too could do insane things and survive. The final German resistance collapsed at approximately 1130 hours, 90 minutes after the assault began. German defenders in Foy's church, the final strongpoint, attempted surrender, but language barriers and adrenaline-fueled rage complicated the process. Some Germans were taken prisoner cleanly. Some were shot while trying to surrender, killed by Americans who couldn't or wouldn't distinguish between genuine surrender and tactical deception. Some continued fighting until killed. The ethics of close-quarters combat are complicated, and battlefield conditions rarely permit careful moral reasoning. Men made decisions in seconds that they'd spend lifetimes processing. Casualty count: final, 14 killed, 28 wounded, 6 missing initially, all later confirmed killed in action. 48 casualties from 64 men, 75%. But the military doesn't count casualties that way. They count combat effectiveness, which is different. Combat effectiveness means soldiers who can still fight, which excludes killed and seriously wounded, but includes walking wounded and men in shock, who haven't yet realized they can't continue. By that metric, Easy Company had perhaps 21 men combat effective, after taking Foy, 21 from 64, 33% effectiveness. Below the 50% threshold where military units typically cease functioning as cohesive organizations. Foy was declared secured at 1145 hours. The church steeple no longer provided German observation. The road junction was in American hands. The objective had been achieved. But achievement feels hollow when you're standing in a Belgian street surrounded by bodies. American bodies, German bodies, Belgian civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire, and trying to remember why this particular cluster of stone buildings mattered enough to justify what it cost. The answer was strategic, had to do with road networks and observation and widening the Bastogne corridor. But strategic explanations don't help much when you're looking at friends' bodies frozen in the snow. January 13, 1945, 1135 hours. Foy Village Center. Medic Eugene Rowe worked in the church basement, surrounded by wounded men, and tried to determine who would live and who would die. Triage. The word comes from French, means to sort. Developed during the Napoleonic Wars when battlefield medicine first began using systematic categorization of casualties. 3 categories: those who will survive without immediate treatment, those who will die regardless of treatment, those for whom immediate treatment makes the difference. Rowe had perhaps 18 wounded men in this basement, inadequate medical supplies, and no way to evacuate serious cases until the fighting died down completely. So he sorted. The soldier with the sucking chest-wound bullet had penetrated lung, creating hole that pulled air with each breath, received immediate attention. Rhodes sealed the wound with petroleum gauze, administered morphine, marked the man's forehead with M in grease pencil, so other medics would know morphine had been given and wouldn't overdose him. This soldier might survive if evacuated quickly. The soldier with the abdominal wound, bullet through stomach or intestines, abdomen rigid with internal bleeding, received morphine and reassurance. Rowe knew from experience that abdominal wounds were nearly always fatal in field conditions. No surgeon, no operating room, no way to repair internal damage. So he made the soldier comfortable and moved to the next casualty. There's no good word for what that feels like. Choosing who receives care and who receives morphine and kind words while they die. 1158 hours. Squad leaders moved through Foy's streets conducting accountability, trying to determine who was alive, who was dead, who was missing. They called names, some men answered, some didn't. The silence after calling a name acquired different meanings. Sometimes silence meant the soldier was in a different building and hadn't heard. Sometimes it meant he was wounded and couldn't respond. Sometimes it meant he was dead in the snow. 400 meters south, and his body wouldn't be recovered until evening. The squad leaders kept lists, checking off names, marking statuses, present, wounded, missing. 1,200 hours. The survivors gathered in and around Foy's buildings and experienced the peculiar disconnection that follows combat. They'd been hyper-alert for 90 minutes, senses amplified by adrenaline. Every sound and movement potentially lethal. Now the shooting had stopped, and their bodies didn't know how to process the transition. Some men shook uncontrollably, not fear, just neurological response to adrenaline crash. Some became extremely talkative, compulsively describing what they'd seen and done, needing to externalize the experience. Some went silent, staring at nothing, locked inside their own minds processing horrors they couldn't articulate. The German wounded presented moral and practical problems. Geneva Convention required that enemy wounded receive the same medical care as friendly wounded. But medical supplies were critically short, and every bandage used on a German was a bandage not available for an American. Medic Rowe treated German casualties anyway, partly because Geneva Convention compliance mattered, and partly because he was a medic, and treating wounded people was what medics did. Some American soldiers objected, quietly or loudly depending on personality. Arguments erupted, officers intervened. The wounded Germans lay there listening to Americans debate their fate in a language most didn't understand, expressions mixing pain with fear, with resignation. 1,230 hours. The first hot food arrived, canned stew heated over field stoves, coffee that was more hot water than actual coffee, but hot and liquid and therefore precious. Men ate mechanically, shoveling food without tasting it, their bodies demanding calories after the metabolic spike of combat. Some men couldn't eat, nausea overriding hunger. Some ate voraciously and immediately vomited, nervous systems too disrupted to process food normally. The officers didn't force it. You eat if you can, and if you can't, you don't. Eventually appetite would return, or it wouldn't, but you couldn't force these things. 1,315 hours. Chaplain John Maloney moved through Foy, offering religious comfort to anyone who wanted it. Some soldiers requested last rites for Catholic casualties. Some wanted prayer. Some wanted to confess things they'd done during the assault. German soldiers shot while surrendering, civilians caught in crossfire, acts of violence that exceeded tactical necessity. Maloney listened without judgment, offered absolution where appropriate, and carried the burden of those confessions like every military chaplain since warfare began. The things he heard in Foy would stay with him until his death 40 years later, secrets he couldn't share even with his own family. The practical work of consolidating the position began. Soldiers cleared buildings of remaining German equipment and booby traps. Engineers swept for mines. Machine gun positions were reoriented to face east and northeast, preparing for potential German counterattack. The church steeple that had been such an advantage for German defenders now became an American observation post. The transformation from attacked to defender, from objective to position, occurred with routine efficiency that demonstrated these soldiers' professionalism even in exhaustion. 1,400 hours. Graves registration teams began their work, identifying dead, recovering bodies, preparing them for burial or evacuation. This was skilled labor that required strong stomach and emotional detachment. You rolled bodies over to check for identification tags. Sometimes the tags were there. Sometimes they'd been blown off by the same explosion that killed the soldier. Sometimes you had to search pockets for letters or personal items that might provide identification. Bodies frozen solid were especially difficult, requiring 2 men to lift in position. The teams worked methodically, respectfully, treating the dead with dignity even though the dead were beyond caring. Private Webster sat against a stone wall in Foy and tried to write in his journal, but his hand shook too badly to form legible words. He'd survived. Others hadn't. The arbitrary nature of it, why he lived when Campbell died, when both had crossed the same ground under the same fire, defied rational explanation. Luck, perhaps, or divine intervention if you believed in such things, or simple statistical probability that said some percentage would survive, and he happened to be in that percentage. None of those explanations felt adequate. None of them addressed the fundamental question that would haunt him and thousands of other combat veterans for decades. Why me and not them? The hour after combat, the first hour of survival, should feel like relief, should feel like celebration. But mostly it feels like exhaustion, mixed with guilt, mixed with the knowledge that this isn't over, that tomorrow or next week there'll be another objective that requires another assault and more names added to the casualty lists. Easy Company had taken Foy, had accomplished the mission, had proven themselves capable of extraordinary violence in service of military objectives. And the cost of that proof sat in the church basement, bleeding, lay in the snow freezing, would arrive in telegram form to American homes over the coming weeks. Strategic success, tactical victory, human catastrophe, all three simultaneously true, and the survivors had to find some way to hold all three truths in their minds without breaking under the weight. January 15th, 1945, 1300 hours, Henri Chapelle American Cemetery, Belgium. The grave diggers worked frozen ground with pickaxes and shovels, chipping through earth hardened by cold into something approaching stone. Each grave required approximately 2 hours of labor, 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 7 feet long. The standard American military grave, row upon row of white crosses marking men who died in Belgium, France, Holland, Germany. Among them Private James Campbell, age 19, killed in action January 13, 1945. His body had been recovered the evening after the assault, identified by dog tags, processed through graves registration, and now rested in temporary burial, awaiting post-war repatriation. His mother had requested his body be returned to Pennsylvania. That request would be honored in 1948, 3 years after his death. But Campbell was just one name, one story among 48 casualties from the Foy assault. Each casualty represented a life compressed into military records. Date of birth, date of enlistment, date of death, cause of death reduced to bureaucratic categories. KIA, killed in action, DOW, died of wounds, MIA, missing in action. The records don't capture personality, aspirations, the specific fears that kept them awake at night before the assault. Military bureaucracy can't account for those things. It can only count bodies and process paperwork and ensure that families receive notification and death benefits according to regulations. Private David Webster survived the assault with minor shrapnel wounds to his leg, fragments from a mortar round that had landed close enough to wound but not kill. He was evacuated on January 20th with frostbite, his feet blackened and swollen, tissue damage severe enough to require hospitalization but not amputation. He spent 6 weeks in a field hospital in France, then another month in a recovery depot in England. By the time he returned to Easy Company in March, the war had moved into Germany, and most of the men he'd known were dead or transferred. He'd become a stranger in his own unit, connected by shared history to men who weren't there anymore, disconnected from replacements who'd arrived after Foy and didn't share that experience. Sergeant Denver Randleman survived Foy and continued fighting through the Rhineland campaign, the final push into Germany that followed the Ardennes fighting. On March 20th, 1945, a German sniper shot him through the throat during a patrol near the Rhine River. The bullet severed his carotid artery. He bled out in approximately 90 seconds, held by another sergeant who tried futilely to compress the wound. Randleman was 31 years old. He'd survived Normandy, Holland, Bastogne, and Foy, only to die in a routine patrol action 6 weeks before Germany surrendered. His body is buried in Netherlands, American Cemetery, Section H, Row 12, Grave 43. His family never recovered his remains. Staff Sergeant Carwood Lipton survived the war without serious physical injury, remarkable given his service from D-Day through VE Day in frontline positions. He received a battlefield commission to second lieutenant in April 1945, recognition of his competent leadership under impossible conditions. Post-war, he returned to West Virginia, married, worked in civilian engineering, and rarely spoke about his combat experience. When Stephen Ambrose interviewed him in the 1990s for Band of Brothers, Lipton described the Foy assault in measured language that emphasized tactical details over personal trauma. Only when pressed did he acknowledge the psychological cost, the nightmares that persisted decades after, the inability to form close friendships because everyone he'd been close to had died. Medic Eugene Rose survived and continued serving as Easy Company's medic through Germany. Post-war interviews revealed that he suffered severe post-traumatic stress, though it wasn't called that in 1945, including recurring dreams about casualties he'd failed to save. He returned to Louisiana, worked in construction, married late. Friends described him as quiet, withdrawn, uncomfortable in crowds. He attended one Easy Company reunion in the 1980s, then never returned, reportedly saying that seeing surviving veterans forced him to remember the dead and he preferred to leave those memories buried. Private Albert Blythe, the soldier who'd suffered hysterical blindness in Normandy and fought mechanically through Foy, was wounded by artillery fire in mid-January during operations following the Foy assault. Shrapnel through the shoulder and neck, serious but survivable. He was evacuated and spent months recovering. Contrary to popular belief, he didn't die from those wounds. He returned to military service, served in Korea, and died in 1967 from complications of a perforated ulcer while still on active duty. The Band of Brothers miniseries incorrectly portrayed him as dying from Foy-related wounds, a historical error that Blythe's family spent years trying to correct. The statistical analysis of Easy Company's Foy casualties reveals patterns that military psychiatrists would later study when developing understanding of combat trauma. Of the 64 men who assaulted Foy, 14 died immediately, 11 more died in subsequent actions before VE Day, and 39 survived the war. But survival is a complex term. Of those 39 survivors, post-war records indicate that approximately 60% sought treatment for what we'd now call PTSD. Nightmares, anxiety, depression, substance abuse. Marriage statistics show higher divorce rates than national averages. Employment records show frequent job changes, difficulty maintaining steady work. Suicide rates among combat veterans were elevated, though exact numbers are difficult to determine because many deaths classified as accidents may have been intentional. The decorations awarded for the Foy assault tell their own story. 3 Silver Stars, the third highest military decoration for valor, were awarded, though one recipient died before receiving it. 12 Bronze Stars for meritorious service or heroism in ground combat. 8 Purple Hearts for combat wounds, though this number excludes soldiers wounded but who remained in action and never reported their injuries. The decorations process was arbitrary and incomplete. Many acts of courage went unrecognized because nobody survived to witness them, or because officers who would have recommended decorations were themselves casualties, or because bureaucratic paperwork failed in the chaos of ongoing operations. 1952, 7 years after Foy, the first informal Easy Company reunion occurred in Pennsylvania, organized by wives who'd watched their husbands struggle with post-war adjustment and thought reconnecting with fellow veterans might help. 12 men attended. They spent 3 days drinking, talking, filling gaps in each other's memories of events, too chaotic for any one person to have complete knowledge. Some found the reunion helpful, cathartic even. Others found it re-traumatized them, forcing confrontation with memories they'd worked hard to suppress. The reunions continued sporadically through the 50s and 60s, with attendance varying based on who could make the trip and who could emotionally handle the experience. 2001. The HBO miniseries Band of Brothers premiered, based on Stephen Ambrose's book, bringing Easy Company's story to mass audiences. Surviving veterans, by then in their 70s and 80s, suddenly found themselves celebrated as heroes, invited to premieres and ceremonies, asked for autographs and photographs. For some, the recognition was gratifying, validation of sacrifices made 6 decades earlier. For others, it was complicated. The miniseries dramatized events, compressed timelines, created composite characters. It turned trauma into entertainment, suffering into narrative arc. And it made the Foy assault, 90 minutes of horror that many survivors had spent 60 years trying to forget, into a celebrated moment of triumph. The question of what they carried home from Foy isn't answerable in conventional terms. Physical wounds healed or didn't. Amputated limbs remained amputated. Frostbite damaged feet caused lifelong pain. But the psychological burdens were less visible and more persistent. They carried images of friends dying, sounds of men screaming, the smell of burning buildings and blood and cordite. They carried guilt about surviving when others hadn't. They carried knowledge of what they'd done, the Germans shot while surrendering, the civilians caught in crossfire, the violence that exceeded tactical necessity, and they carried the unbridgeable gap between their experience and civilian life, the impossibility of explaining to people who hadn't been there what it meant to cross 400 meters of snow-covered ground while machine guns tried to kill you. January 14th, 1945, 0800 hours. Graves Registration Collecting Point. Captain James Walsh stood before rows of bodies laid out on canvas, tarps, and conducted the grim accounting that military operations require. Each body had been searched for identification, personal effects removed and catalogued, cause of death assessed where possible. The paperwork was extensive: individual deceased personnel files, personal effects inventories, location and circumstances of death, all of it necessary for notifying families, processing death benefits, maintaining accurate casualty statistics. But the paperwork couldn't capture what Walsh saw in front of him: 48 Americans killed or dead of wounds from the assault on one small Belgian village. The casualty breakdown revealed the assault's lethality with mathematical precision: 14 killed in action during the assault itself, dead before medics could reach them, catastrophic wounds incompatible with life; 6 missing in action, later confirmed killed, soldiers whose bodies were scattered across the approach to Foy, some not recovered until the snow melted in spring; 4 died of wounds after reaching medical facilities, injuries too severe for field medicine to address, men who lingered hours or days before succumbing; 28 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, though this number excluded walking wounded who remained with their units, and soldiers who refused treatment for minor injuries because they didn't want to leave their squads. The casualty rate, 48 from 64 attackers, translated to 75%, a percentage that places the Foy assault among the most costly small unit actions in American military history. For comparison, the D-Day landings on Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of the Normandy beaches, produced approximately 7.3% casualties among assault forces in the critical first hours. Operation Market Garden, the failed airborne assault in Holland, cost the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment approximately 12.1% casualties over 9 days of fighting. Foy produced 75% casualties in 90 minutes. The disparity reveals everything about the difference between assaults with adequate support and assaults without it. Medical analysis of wound types provided clinical insight into how men died. 67% suffered gunshot wounds, bullet injuries from rifles or machine guns. The distribution of wounds wasn't random. Most gunshot casualties were hit in the torso or head, the body's center mass that German machine gunners aimed for instinctively. Extremity wounds, arms and legs, were less common because soldiers wounded in extremities often survived and continued fighting, thus weren't represented in killed-in-action statistics. 22% suffered fragmentation wounds from mortar rounds or artillery shells, shrapnel injuries that ranged from minor lacerations to catastrophic trauma depending on proximity to explosion. 11% died from other causes including blast trauma, crush injuries from building collapses, and medical complications like shock or blood loss. The time-to-casualty ratio provided another measure of the assault's intensity. 48 casualties over 90 minutes equals 1 casualty every 1.88 minutes. That's approximately 32 casualties per hour, sustained rate of loss that most military units can't endure without complete collapse. The fact that Easy Company continued functioning until mission completion despite those losses speaks to training, leadership, and desperation. But it also speaks to the fundamental mathematical reality that military units have breaking points, percentages of casualties beyond which cohesion fails, and Easy Company reached that breaking point during the assault, but kept going anyway through sheer momentum and lack of alternatives. The replacement timeline revealed how long it took to restore Easy Company to combat effectiveness after Foy. The official requirement was 64 replacements to restore the company to authorized strength. But replacements weren't immediately available. The replacement depot system was overwhelmed by casualties from the Ardennes fighting, with thousands of soldiers requiring replacement across multiple divisions. Priority went to divisions still in active combat. Easy Company, having achieved its immediate objective, fell lower on priority lists. Consequently, replacements trickled in slowly, 4 men here, 7 there, until by March 15th, 2 months after Foy, the company finally reached something approaching authorized strength. But those were new soldiers, untested, unknown to the veterans, lacking the cohesion that makes units effective. Comparative casualty analysis placed Foy in broader context of World War II small unit actions. The assault on Tarawa Atoll in the Pacific Theater produced approximately 19% casualties among Marine assault forces over 72 hours. The Hurtgen Forest fighting produced approximately 28% casualties across 1st Army units over 3 months. The crossing of the Rapio River in Italy produced approximately 48% casualties in 36th Division units over 48 hours. Foy's 75% casualty rate in 90 minutes exceeded all of these, suggesting that either the Foy assault was extraordinarily difficult or extraordinarily mismanaged, or both. The Purple Heart Medal awarded for combat wounds provides another measure of human cost. 8 Purple Hearts were officially awarded for Foy assault wounds, a number that seems absurdly low given that 28 men were evacuated wounded. The discrepancy reveals bureaucratic failure. Purple Heart regulations required that wounds be officially documented, which meant medic or doctor examination and paperwork completion. But in the chaos of combat and immediate aftermath, much of this paperwork never got completed. Soldiers wounded but still capable of fighting often refused evacuation and never reported their injuries to avoid being separated from their units. Other soldiers died of wounds before paperwork could be processed, and killed-in-action personnel don't receive Purple Hearts because death is documented differently. The financial cost of the Foy assault can be calculated in grim accounting. Each American combat death cost the government approximately $10,000 in death benefits, funeral expenses, and administrative processing, $1945, equivalent to perhaps $150,000 current dollars. 14 killed equals $2.1 million in death-related costs. 28 seriously wounded required medical treatment, averaging approximately $15,000 per casualty, $420,000. Training replacement soldiers to replace casualties cost approximately $8,000 per soldier, $384,000 for 48 replacements. Total financial cost, approximately $3 million in period currency to take one Belgian village. That doesn't include ammunition expended, equipment destroyed, or long-term disability payments to wounded veterans. But financial calculations miss the point. The real cost wasn't measurable in currency. It was measured in families destroyed, in potential unrealized, in psychological trauma that would echo through decades. James Campbell, killed at 19, never attended college, never married, never had children. His bloodline ended. His potential contributions to society, whatever he might have invented or discovered or created, vanished. Multiply that by 14, killed at Foy, then by approximately 400,000 Americans killed in World War II, and you begin to grasp the civilizational cost of warfare. Not just the immediate dead, but all the futures that died with them. The ultimate question that casualty analysis raises, was Foy worth the cost? From purely military perspective, the answer is ambiguous. Taking Foy eliminated German observation of Bastogne's southern approaches, potentially saving 200 to 400 American casualties from artillery fire over subsequent weeks. 48 American casualties to prevent 400 casualties produces positive exchange ratio if you're willing to think about human lives as tradable commodities. But military operations aren't conducted in isolation. The psychological cost of the Foy assault, the trauma inflicted on survivors, the erosion of Easy Company's cohesion, the message sent to other units about acceptable casualty rates, had effects that cascaded beyond simple body counts. And those effects defy quantification, even as they shape outcomes. January 14, 1945, 1600 hours. Battalion Aid Station, 2 kilometers south of Foy. Private Robert Marsh sat on a cot in the battalion aid station and stared at nothing. Not sleeping, not unconscious, just staring. Captain Harry Beasley, battalion surgeon, had seen this before. Combat exhaustion, battle fatigue, psychoneurosis. The terms varied, but the condition was consistent. Marsh had assaulted Foy, survived the assault with no physical wounds, performed his duties adequately during the fighting. Then that evening, he'd simply stopped functioning. Stopped speaking, stopped responding to orders, stopped acknowledging the external world. He sat with that same blank stare for 6 hours before his squad leader brought him to the aid station. The diagnosis in 1945 was imprecise because psychiatric understanding of combat trauma was still rudimentary. Doctors knew that sustained combat broke some men's minds but didn't understand the neurological mechanisms. They used terms like shell shock, inherited from World War I, when doctors had believed that artillery concussions physically damaged brains. By World War II, understanding had progressed to recognizing psychological rather than physical causation, but treatment remained primitive. 3 to 7 days of rest, sedation with barbiturates, then return to duty. The theory was that removing soldiers from combat stress would allow psychological recovery. The reality was that approximately 75% of soldiers treated for combat exhaustion and returned to their units experienced relapse within weeks. Battalion records from mid-January 1945 documented 24 cases of combat exhaustion among units involved in the Foy assault, soldiers diagnosed with psychiatric conditions severe enough to require removal from combat. This number represented only cases serious enough to prevent basic functioning. It didn't count the soldiers who experienced anxiety, depression, nightmares, and hypervigilance, but remained marginally functional. It didn't count the soldiers who self-medicated with alcohol, scavenged from Belgian homes or German supplies. It didn't count the soldiers whose hands shook constantly, or who flinched at loud noises, or who couldn't sleep without sedatives. Those men stayed with their units because medical doctrine distinguished between psychiatric casualties who couldn't fight and soldiers who could fight despite psychiatric symptoms. The official terminology, combat exhaustion, suggested that the condition was temporary, reversible through rest. But follow-up studies conducted on World War II veterans in the decades after the war revealed different reality. Soldiers diagnosed with combat exhaustion showed elevated rates of psychiatric hospitalization, substance abuse, suicide, and violent crime for decades after discharge. The label might have been exhaustion, but the condition was more accurately described as injury, psychological trauma that damaged cognitive and emotional function as surely as bullets damaged tissue. Medical officers conducting interviews with combat exhaustion cases identified common patterns. Nearly all patients described intrusive memories, specific moments from combat that replayed involuntarily, triggered by sounds or smells or random associations. Many described emotional numbing, inability to feel joy, sadness, or connection to other people. Many reported hypervigilance, constant scanning for threats, inability to relax, exaggerated startle response. Sleep disturbances were universal. Nightmares about combat, inability to fall asleep, waking at slightest noise. These symptoms described in clinical language in 1945 medical reports precisely match what modern psychiatry would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But PTSD wouldn't be formally recognized as diagnostic category until 1980, codified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 3rd edition, largely due to advocacy by Vietnam War veterans and their psychiatrists. World War II veterans who suffered these symptoms had no diagnosis, no recognized condition, no treatment protocol. They were simply nervous or high-strung or not adjusting well to civilian life. Their symptoms were dismissed as weakness or cowardice or inability to handle adult responsibilities, and they internalized these judgments, believing something was wrong with them personally, rather than recognizing they were suffering predictable responses to traumatic events. The military's treatment approach in 1945 reflected prevailing psychiatric theory that emphasized rapid return to duty. The logic was that allowing soldiers to be evacuated for psychiatric reasons would encourage malingering and undermine morale. Better to treat combat exhaustion as temporary condition, requiring brief rest, then return soldiers to their units. This approach preserved manpower. Every soldier returned to duty was one less replacement needed, but it ignored the human cost. Soldiers returned to combat while still psychologically fragile, often broke completely, becoming permanent psychiatric casualties who required lifelong care. The military saved short-term replacement costs, but created long-term disability obligations. Individual case studies reveal the human reality behind clinical statistics. Private Thomas Keane, 20 years old, assaulted Foy and killed approximately 3 German soldiers during house-to-house fighting, clear combat success by military standards. But one of those Germans was a teenager, maybe 16 years old, who Keane shot at close range after the boy fumbled with his rifle. Keane saw the boy's face, saw the terror in his eyes, pulled the trigger anyway because that's what combat required. He functioned adequately for the rest of the assault, helped consolidate the position, performed guard duty that night. Then the next morning, he started screaming, uncontrollable, incoherent screaming that continued for hours until medics sedated him. He never returned to combat duty, spent 3 months in psychiatric hospital, received discharge for disability in May 1945. The relationship between physical and psychological trauma, complicated diagnosis and treatment. Soldiers with both physical wounds and psychological symptoms received treatment for physical wounds, while psychological symptoms were often dismissed as natural reaction to injury. But studies showed that soldiers with minor physical wounds often developed more severe psychological symptoms than soldiers with serious wounds. The explanation? Minor wounds provided socially acceptable reason for psychiatric symptoms. A soldier could attribute shaking hands or nightmares to still recovering from my wound, rather than acknowledging psychological trauma. Serious wounds often produced less psychological trauma because they provided clear, visible justification for removal from combat. The long-term outcomes for Foy assault survivors who developed combat exhaustion varied tremendously based on factors that 1945 psychiatry couldn't predict. Some recovered adequately, lived productive lives, experienced occasional anxiety or nightmares, but functioned well enough. Others never recovered, cycling through psychiatric hospitalizations, struggling with employment and relationships, dying young from suicide or alcohol-related illness. And the difference between these outcomes didn't correlate neatly with severity of combat exposure or initial symptom severity. Two soldiers could experience nearly identical combat, develop similar symptoms, receive identical treatment, and have completely different life trajectories, for reasons that remain mysterious. The unanswered question that haunted military psychiatrists then and continues haunting trauma researchers now: why do some people break and others don't? What makes one soldier resilient and another vulnerable when both experience the same combat? Proposed explanations included pre-existing psychological conditions, childhood trauma, genetic factors, social support networks, unit cohesion, quality of leadership, even random chance. But none of these explanations fully account for the variation in outcomes. The truth is that human psychology is complex, and combat trauma affects each person differently in ways that resist simple categorization or prediction, which means that sending soldiers into combat inevitably produces psychiatric casualties, and the military simply accepts this as operational cost of warfare. May 8, 1945, VA Day. Easy Company positions, Bavaria, Germany. The war in Europe ended not with dramatic final battle, but with administrative formality. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Orders came down through channels: cease offensive operations, establish occupation positions, begin processing for redeployment or discharge. The surviving members of Easy Company, perhaps 30 from the original 139 who jumped into Normandy 11 months earlier, received the news with muted response. Some celebration, certainly. Alcohol appeared from somewhere and toasts were raised, but mostly there was exhaustion, relief mixed with uncertainty about what came next, and the complicated knowledge that while the war was over, its effects would continue indefinitely. Private David Webster, recovered from his Foy wounds and frostbite, had rejoined Easy Company in March and participated in the final push into Germany. VE Day found him in a requisitioned German house, wondering what came next. Return to college? Resume the life interrupted by enlistment? But he changed in ways that made resuming previous life seem impossible. The person who'd volunteered for paratroopers in 1942, idealistic, adventurous, confident, no longer existed. In his place was someone harder, more damaged, carrying knowledge of human capacity for violence that couldn't be unlearned. How do you discuss literature in college seminars when you've killed people and watched friends die? How do you care about trivial civilian concerns when you've seen what war does to human bodies and minds? The demobilization process stretched across months as military bureaucracy processed millions of soldiers for discharge or retention. Easy Company veterans received priority for discharge, based on point system that credited combat time, decorations, and time in service. Most accumulated enough points for discharge by summer 1945. They boarded ships in Europe, crossed the Atlantic, processed through separation centers that provided medical examinations and mustering out pay. Then they received discharge papers, train tickets home, and were released into civilian life with minimal support or transition assistance. The government provided GI Bill educational benefits and home loan guarantees, but little help with the psychological transition from combat soldier to civilian. 1946. Easy Company veterans scattered across America, attempting to resume lives interrupted by war. Statistical analysis of their outcomes reveals patterns both inspiring and troubling. Approximately 78% married within 3 years of discharge, many to women they'd known before the war, some to women they met after discharge who were attracted to veteran status or the confidence combat experience produced. Marriage rates significantly exceeded national averages, suggesting that veterans sought stability and normalcy through family formation. But beneath that statistical success lurked complications. Divorce rates among Easy Company veterans reached approximately 45% within 10 years of marriage, nearly double the 25% national average for the period. The reasons varied, but themes recurred in divorce proceedings: inability to discuss combat experiences with spouses, emotional distance, anger management problems, alcohol abuse, infidelity. Combat trauma doesn't respect marriage vows or civilian expectations. Veterans struggled to form intimate connections because intimacy requires vulnerability, and combat teaches that vulnerability gets you killed. They struggled with normal civilian conflicts because their conflict resolution framework had been shaped by situations where disputes were resolved with violence, and they struggled with spouses who couldn't understand why decorated war heroes seemed unable to handle ordinary life challenges. Employment outcomes showed similar mixed patterns. 67% of tracked Easy Company veterans achieved middle-class status through combination of GI Bill education, VA home loans, and post-war economic expansion. They became engineers, teachers, managers, business owners. Success stories by conventional metrics. But 23% struggled with sustained employment, cycling through jobs, unable to maintain steady work. Some struggled due to physical disabilities from combat wounds. Others struggled because psychological trauma made civilian work environments intolerable, couldn't handle authority, couldn't tolerate routine, couldn't function in environments where the stakes felt trivial compared to combat. The first informal Easy Company reunion occurred in 1952, 7 years after war's end. 12 veterans attended, gathering in Pennsylvania for 3 days of drinking and storytelling. The reunion served multiple functions: reconnection with people who shared experiences that couldn't be explained to civilians, verification of memories from combat that felt increasingly unreal in civilian life, communal processing of trauma in an environment where everyone understood without judgment. Some veterans found the reunion therapeutic, left feeling less isolated and more capable of managing civilian life. Others found it re-traumatized them, awakened memories they'd worked to suppress, left them struggling for months afterward. Reunion attendance fluctuated over decades, peaking in the 1980s and 90s when veterans were retired and had time for travel. The peak reunion in 1992 attracted 34 attendees from approximately 45 living Easy Company veterans of that era. Attendees ranged from men who'd maintained close friendships and regular contact, to men who hadn't seen each other since 1945. The reunions developed rituals: memorial service for deceased comrades, reading of names, moment of silence. These rituals provided structure for grief and honoring sacrifice, but they also highlighted the diminishing number of survivors and the approaching time when no Easy Company veterans would remain alive. Psychological studies conducted on World War II veterans in the 1980s and 90s revealed long-term patterns of combat trauma that medical science hadn't recognized in the 1940s. Approximately 60% of interviewed Easy Company survivors reported symptoms consistent with PTSD diagnosis, nightmares about combat that persisted for decades, hypervigilance and exaggerated startle response, emotional numbing, difficulty with intimate relationships. Many reported that symptoms intensified in late middle age and retirement, when reduced work demands meant more time for unwanted memories to intrude. The pattern was so common among combat veterans that psychiatrists developed a term for it: delayed onset PTSD, though more likely the symptoms had been present all along and veterans had simply been too busy with work and family to acknowledge them. The public narrative around Easy Company transformed dramatically with publication of Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers in 1992 and the HBO miniseries in 2001. Suddenly, these elderly men found themselves celebrated as the greatest generation, invited to premieres and ceremonies, asked for autographs by strangers who'd watched dramatized versions of their combat experiences. For some veterans, the recognition was gratifying, validation that their service and sacrifice mattered, that people still remembered and appreciated what they'd done. For others, it was complicated and sometimes painful. The miniseries took dramatic liberties that troubled veterans who valued historical accuracy. Events were compressed, timelines altered, composite characters created. The Foy assault, 90 minutes of horror in January 1945, became a triumphant 7-minute sequence with heroic charges and clear leadership. Lieutenant Dyke was portrayed as incompetent coward. Lieutenant Spears became superhero running through enemy fire. The reality: desperate men attacking fortified position because orders required it, taking catastrophic casualties, succeeding through persistence and willingness to absorb losses, was too complex and dark for television drama. Entertainment requires heroes and villains, clear moral lines, satisfying narrative arcs. Reality provides moral ambiguity, bureaucratic failures, and survivors struggling with guilt and trauma for 60 years. Veteran reactions to Band of Brothers ranged from appreciative to angry. Some felt the series honored their service, even if details were inaccurate. Others felt betrayed by the inaccuracies, particularly the portrayal of Dyke and the simplification of complex events. Several veterans wrote letters to HBO and media outlets, trying to correct the record, noting that Dyke had been adequate commander in impossible situation rather than incompetent coward. But their corrections received little attention, because the dramatic narrative was more compelling than historical nuance, and audiences preferred the simplified version where heroic soldiers overcame obstacles through courage and leadership, rather than the messy reality where men died due to strategic necessity and tactical impossibility. The final Easy Company reunion occurred in 2017. 4 veterans attended, the last survivors from a company that had numbered 139 on D-Day. They were in their 90s, physically frail but mentally sharp, carrying 72 years of post-war life since Foy. They sat together and talked about men dead for 7 decades, as if those men had just left the room. They filled gaps in each other's memories, corrected details, laughed at shared jokes that nobody else could understand, and they acknowledged, without explicitly stating it, that this was probably their last gathering, that within a few years all of them would be dead, and Easy Company would exist only in books and films and fading memories. The question that haunts the long march home from Forres and all of World War II: was it worth it? The question is almost impossible to answer honestly, because it requires weighing in commensurable values: defeating Nazi Germany, preventing Holocaust continuation, establishing post-war democratic order. These were unquestionably valuable achievements, worth tremendous sacrifice. But the sacrifice was borne unevenly. Some veterans returned home, lived productive lives, died peacefully in old age surrounded by families. Others returned broken, struggled for decades with psychological trauma, died young from suicide or alcohol-related illness. And the question of whether the collective achievement justified the individual costs depends entirely on whose life you're evaluating. June 8, 1998. Stephen Ambrose's office, University of New Orleans. Historian Stephen Ambrose sat surrounded by transcripts from veteran interviews and tried to construct coherent narrative from fragments of memory. He'd interviewed 23 Easy Company veterans over the past 4 years, recording their stories about Normandy, Market Garden, Bastogne, and Foy. But the interviews revealed a problem that every historian of combat eventually confronts. Memory is unreliable. Veterans describing the same events provided contradictory accounts. They disagreed on timelines, casualty figures, who did what, even basic facts like weather conditions. Some disagreements reflected honest confusion. Combat is chaotic and individual soldiers see only small pieces of larger actions. But other contradictions suggested something more troubling. Memory wasn't just incomplete, it was actively reshaping itself over time. The January 13th Foy assault existed in multiple versions depending on who told the story. Some veterans remembered the attack jumping off at 0900 hours, others at 1000 hours. Official after-action reports listed 1000 hours, but several veterans insisted they remembered checking their watches and seeing earlier times. Casualty figures varied even more dramatically. After-action reports documented 20 killed in action during and immediately after the assault. But veteran oral histories suggested numbers ranging from 14 to 28, depending on whether you counted men who died of wounds hours later or soldiers listed as missing who were later confirmed dead. None of these numbers matched the 48 total casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, that represented the assault's full cost. The relief of Lieutenant Norman Dyke presented the most contentious historical controversy. The popular narrative, repeated in countless retellings and eventually dramatized in Band of Brothers, portrayed Dyke as incompetent officer who froze under fire and was relieved for cowardice. But primary documentation told different story. Official records showed Dyke was reassigned to battalion staff on January 13th, administrative language that suggested routine transfer rather than relief for cause. No documentation existed of Dyke freezing during combat. No after-action report mentioned his performance as deficient. The story of Dyke's incompetence appeared to originate from post-war veteran interviews, conducted decades after the events. when memory had been shaped by 50 years of retelling and embellishment. Lieutenant Ronald Spear's legendary run through Foy, sprinting across 200 meters of contested ground, linking up with Dog Company, then running back, was confirmed by multiple witnesses. 3 veterans specifically remembered seeing Spears make the run, but 5 others interviewed said they'd heard about the run but hadn't personally witnessed it. 2 suggested the story might have been exaggerated or conflated with other events. Military historians analyzing the tactical situation noted that such a run would have been extraordinarily dangerous and tactically unnecessary. Radio communication could have achieved the same coordination, but the story persisted because it was dramatic, because it exemplified the kind of fearless leadership men wanted to believe in, and because questioning it felt like dishonoring Spear's genuine courage. The transformation of historical event into mythologized narrative follows predictable patterns that historians and psychologists have documented across multiple wars and cultures. Initial memories are fragmented and traumatic, lacking coherent structure. Over time, individuals and groups construct narratives that impose order on chaos, identify heroes and villains, create meaning from random violence. These narratives serve psychological functions. They help veterans process trauma, help societies honor sacrifice, help subsequent generations understand why war was necessary. But the narratives diverge from actual events in ways that are sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic, and always in service of present needs rather than past accuracy. The Band of Brothers miniseries, premiering in 2001, crystallized this mythologization process. The production was remarkably well researched by Hollywood standards. Producers interviewed veterans, consulted historical documents, hired military advisors, but they were creating entertainment, not documentary, which meant narrative requirements superseded historical precision. The Foy episode compressed 9 days of operations into what appeared to be 48 hours. It portrayed Dyke as obviously incompetent, hesitating and giving contradictory orders while men died. It showed Spears taking command and immediately transforming Easy Company's performance, and it depicted the assault as heroic triumph rather than desperate action that succeeded through willingness to absorb catastrophic casualties. Surviving veterans' reactions to the miniseries revealed the complicated relationship between participants and public memory of their experiences. 12 Easy Company veterans attended the premiere in 2001. Some were moved to tears, grateful that their service was being honored and their fallen comrades remembered. Others were troubled by the inaccuracies, particularly the treatment of Dyke. Several veterans later gave interviews defending Dyke, noting that he'd been adequate commander in impossible situation and that his relief had more to do with battalion-level politics than individual failure. But these corrections received minimal media attention because the dramatic narrative was already established and audiences preferred the simplified version. The accuracy disputes extended to specific tactical details. The miniseries showed Easy Company attacking in daylight across snow-covered fields. Accurate. It showed them taking heavy casualties. Accurate. But it simplified the assault into single continuous action, when reality involved multiple pauses, repositioning, attempts to coordinate with supporting units. It portrayed Spears running through Foy as inspirational leadership moment, when reality was more ambiguous. Possibly tactical necessity, possibly reckless showboating, possibly legendary event that never happened quite the way it's remembered. And it created satisfying narrative arc where leadership change immediately improved performance, when reality was that Easy Company succeeded primarily through numerical superiority and willingness to absorb losses that German defenders couldn't match. Academic historians studying the Foy assault, using primary sources, after-action reports, casualty lists, radio logs, German defensive documents captured after the battle, constructed version of events that differed from both veteran memories and popular dramatization. The academic version emphasized strategic context. Foy was one small action in larger Bastogne campaign, which was itself one part of massive Ardennes offensive. It noted that Foy's tactical importance was real but limited. Taking the town widened the Bastogne corridor and eliminated German observation, but didn't fundamentally change the campaign's trajectory. And it calculated that the 48 American casualties at Foy potentially prevented 200 to 400 casualties from German artillery over subsequent weeks, making it strategically justified despite tactical brutality. But the academic version lacked emotional resonance. It reduced men to statistics, sacrifice to cost-benefit analysis, trauma to strategic outcome. It was accurate in ways that popular narrative wasn't, but it was also incomplete because it couldn't capture the lived experience of crossing 400 meters under machine gun fire, of watching friends die in the snow, of living for 70 years with memories and guilt and nightmares. The popular narrative captured emotional reality even as it distorted historical facts, and the tension between these versions, academic precision versus emotional truth, reflects fundamental challenge in representing war. Accuracy and meaning often pull in opposite directions. The controversy over Norman Dyke's reputation became test case for how historical memory treats individuals. Dyke died in 1995, 6 years before Band of Brothers aired, unable to defend himself against the portrayal of incompetence. His family spent years trying to correct the record, providing documentation that he'd served adequately, that his relief had been administrative rather than punitive, that he'd gone on to successful military career after the war. But the damage was done. Popular memory had decided that Dyke was the coward whose incompetence cost American lives, and Spears was the hero who saved the day. The actual historical record, more ambiguous, less dramatic, couldn't compete with a narrative that offered clear heroes and villains. The ethical questions this raised troubled some historians. Do we owe accuracy to historical figures who can't defend themselves? Does dramatization for entertainment purposes justify distorting real people's reputations? Where is the line between acceptable simplification and defamatory fabrication? These questions had no simple answers. Producers argued they'd created composite character that captured broader truth about leadership failures, even if specific details about Dyke were inaccurate. Dyke's defenders argued that destroying a real person's reputation for dramatic effect was unethical regardless of broader truths. And historians noted that once popular narrative is established through film or television, correcting it becomes nearly impossible because audiences remember dramatic scenes more vividly than documentary evidence. The Foy assault's transformation from traumatic event to celebrated legend also revealed what societies choose to remember about war. The parts that got emphasized in retellings: courage, leadership, triumph over adversity, sacrifice for noble cause. The parts that got minimized: bureaucratic failures that made the assault necessary, tactical mistakes that increased casualties, psychological trauma that destroyed survivors' lives, moral ambiguities of close-quarters killing. This selective memory served important functions. It honored veteran service, reinforced national identity, provided models of courage for subsequent generations. But it also obscured realities that might inform better decisions about when and how to commit soldiers to combat. Comparative analysis showed that Foy's mythologization followed patterns seen in other famous military actions. The Alamo became story of heroic last stand rather than strategic blunder. Custer's last stand became tragedy of brave soldiers overwhelmed by numbers rather than consequence of tactical arrogance. The charge of the Light Brigade became symbol of courage rather than catastrophic leadership failure. In each case, subsequent generations extracted meanings that served present needs while glossing over historical complexities. Foy was becoming similar legend, story of elite soldiers overcoming impossible odds through leadership and courage, when reality was more complex, story of desperate men succeeding through willingness to die in sufficient numbers to overwhelm defenders. The final irony was that the veterans themselves participated in this mythologization. In early post-war interviews conducted in the 1940s and 50s, veterans tended to describe Ford as in stark, traumatic language emphasizing chaos, casualties, and horror. But in interviews conducted in the 1980s and 90s, the same veterans often told more heroic versions, emphasizing courage and camaraderie, while minimizing trauma. This wasn't dishonesty, it was psychological evolution. Over time, survivors needed their sacrifice to mean something, needed their trauma to serve noble purpose. So memory reshaped itself, not deliberately but unconsciously, creating narratives that were bearable to live with rather than narratives that were historically precise. January 13th, 2025, 80 years after the assault. Foy, Belgium. The village of Foy sits peaceful under winter sky, snow covering the same fields where men died 80 years earlier. The church still stands, renovated and maintained, serving a congregation of perhaps 100 Belgian families. The roads are paved now, smooth asphalt replacing the rough tracks of 1945. Modern houses mix with restored historic buildings. A small monument near the church honors Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, with bronze plaque listing the names of the dead. Tourists visit regularly, mostly Americans, following Band of Brothers pilgrimage routes through Belgium and France. They take photographs, read the plaque, try to imagine what happened here. Then they return to their hotels and their normal lives, carrying tourist memories rather than traumatic ones. The strategic verdict on Foy's importance has been established through decades of historical analysis. Military historians agree that capturing Foy achieved specific tactical objectives, eliminated German observation posts that had directed artillery onto Bastogne, southern approaches, secured road junction that facilitated Allied logistics, widened the corridor into Bastogne that Patton's armor had opened. Quantitative analysis suggests that these achievements prevented an estimated 200 to 400 American casualties over the subsequent 3 weeks of operations in the sector. Set against the 48 American casualties from the assault itself, this produces favorable exchange ratio from military accounting perspective. But this cost-benefit analysis rests on assumptions that deserve examination. The 200 to 400 prevented casualties is estimate based on German artillery effectiveness before Foy's capture and projected continuing effectiveness if the observation post had remained operational. But German artillery was constrained by ammunition shortages that might have reduced effectiveness regardless, and alternative approaches bypassing Foy rather than assaulting it directly, waiting for German withdrawal as strategic situation deteriorated, might have achieved similar results with lower casualties. The counterfactual scenarios are unknowable, which means the strategic justification for Foy remains fundamentally unprovable. The operational assessment is more clear-cut and more damning. Foy assault violated basic tactical principles that military doctrine had established through painful experience, attacking fortified positions without adequate preparation, without overwhelming fire support, without proper reconnaissance, predictably produces heavy casualties. The January 9th assault failed catastrophically, with 90 casualties, and should have triggered operational reassessment. Instead, command ordered a second assault 4 days later, using essentially the same approach with minimal tactical changes. The second assault succeeded not because tactics improved, but because attackers were willing to absorb 75% casualties to achieve objective. That's not tactical competence. That's trading lives for objectives through sheer persistence. The human cost extended far beyond the 48 immediate casualties. Of the 64 men who assaulted Foy, 14 died in the assault, 11 more died in subsequent actions before V-Day 4 months later, and 39 survived the war. But survival statistics obscure the real outcomes. Post-war tracking of those 39 survivors revealed that approximately 60% sought psychiatric treatment for combat-related trauma, 45% divorced within 10 years of marriage, and 23% struggled with sustained employment. Some survivors lived productive lives into old age. Others died young from suicide, alcohol-related illness, or complications of untreated psychological trauma. The assault produced ripple effects through families and communities that persisted for generations after the shooting stopped. Contemporary military analysis of Foy assault is used in staff colleges and war colleges as case study in what not to do. The tactical mistakes are cataloged systematically: inadequate intelligence about defensive positions, insufficient artillery preparation, unrealistic timeline expectations, failure to learn from initial assault failure, inadequate medical planning for anticipated casualties. Each mistake is analyzed for lessons that might prevent similar failures in future operations. But the deeper lesson that strategic objectives sometimes demand tactical impossibilities, and soldiers die when doctrine and reality collide, receives less emphasis because it raises uncomfortable questions about acceptable casualty rates and circumstances under which command should refuse missions as impossible. The moral reckoning is most difficult and least resolvable. Was commanding officer who ordered the assault morally culpable for casualties? He was executing strategic directives from higher command while facing limited tactical options. Was battalion commander who relieved Dyke morally correct? He was trying to improve leadership under combat conditions, though his decision destroyed one officer's career and may not have actually improved outcomes. Were the soldiers who killed German prisoners during house-to-house fighting guilty of war crimes? They were operating under extreme stress in situations where distinguishing genuine surrender from tactical deception could mean life or death. None of these questions have clear answers because combat creates moral ambiguity that peacetime ethics can't adequately address. The memorial culture surrounding Foy raises its own questions. The monument, the tourist visits, the celebration in books and films, all of this honors sacrifice and remembers the dead. But it also sanitizes the reality, transforming trauma into triumph, making entertainment from suffering. The veterans who survived Foy had complicated relationships with this memorialization. Some appreciated the recognition. Others felt that public celebration of their heroism missed the point, that there was nothing heroic about being ordered to cross 400 meters of killing ground and watching half your company die. The dead, of course, have no opinion. They're remembered in ways that serve the living's needs, whether those memories match reality or not. The last living veteran of the Foy assault died in 2022 at age 97. With his death, the assault transitioned from living memory to history, from events remembered by participants to events reconstructed from documents and oral histories. This transition happens to all historical events eventually, but it marks an important shift. Living veterans could correct inaccuracies, provide context, insist on complexity that popular narratives simplified. Without them, the mythologized version will likely become the accepted version, because myths are more memorable and emotionally satisfying than complex historical reality. The broader question that Foy poses, what we owe the dead and how we remember their sacrifice, has no satisfactory answer. We owe them accuracy in recording what happened, but perfect accuracy is impossible, with fragmentary records and unreliable memories. We owe them meaning, some assurance that their deaths served purpose, but meaning is constructed retroactively and may not match what they believe they were dying for. We owe them honor, but honor often requires simplifying complex people into two-dimensional heroes. And we owe them remembrance, but memory fades as generations pass and priorities shift and new crises demand attention. Standing in modern Foy, looking across those same fields toward Boyajac Woods, the physical geography reveals nothing about the violence that occurred here. The elevation difference that made the assault so lethal is barely perceptible. The distances that seemed impossibly vast under machine gun fire are easily walked in peaceful conditions. The buildings that were fortresses are now homes where families live ordinary lives. Nature and time have erased the physical evidence of combat, leaving only monuments and memories to mark what happened. But perhaps that erasure is appropriate. War is temporary disruption of normal life, not the natural state of human existence. Liolodwe's restoration to peaceful village represents victory, not in the narrow military sense, but in the larger sense. Life continues, people rebuild, trauma heals, or at least scars over. The soldiers who died here would probably prefer that the village became peaceful again, rather than being preserved as permanent memorial to their deaths. The survivors who lived here afterward certainly deserve to inhabit space not forever defined by violence that occurred before they were born. The final assessment of whether Foy was worth the cost depends entirely on perspective and time frame. From immediate tactical perspective, 48 casualties to take one village was catastrophically expensive. From broader strategic perspective, the assault contributed to relieving Bastogne and ultimately defeating Germany, which were objectives worth tremendous sacrifice. From individual perspective, ask the mother who lost her 19-year-old son whether taking Foy was worth it, and the answer will be different than asking the society that benefited from Nazi Germany's defeat. From historical perspective, Foy matters less for its tactical significance than for what it reveals about warfare, the gap between doctrine and reality, the human cost of strategic necessity, the transformation of trauma into myth. The church bell in Foy still rings to mark hours and call faithful to services, the same bell that rang in January 1945 while American and German soldiers killed each other in the streets below, the same bell that will ring long after everyone who remembers that violence has died. The bell doesn't judge, doesn't mourn, doesn't celebrate. It simply marks time passing, which is perhaps the only honest response to historical events that resists simple moral conclusions. Time passes, people die, societies remember and forget and remember differently. And the fields around Foy grow crops and snow and nothing at all to indicate that men once died here for reasons that seemed vital in the moment, but grow increasingly difficult to explain as decades pass. 80 years after the assault, perhaps the most honest reckoning is this. Foy happened because strategic necessity collided with tactical impossibility, and soldiers paid the price for that collision. The men who fought there did so not primarily from patriotism or ideology, but because their training and circumstances left them no alternative. Some acted with courage, some with cowardice, most with simple determination to survive and help their fellow soldiers survive. They succeeded in taking Foy at cost that would be considered unacceptable in modern military operations, but was considered acceptable in 1945's total war. Their sacrifice contributed incrementally to Allied victory in a war that genuinely needed to be won. And the fact that their sacrifice was necessary doesn't make it less tragic, doesn't resolve the moral ambiguities of their actions, doesn't provide clear lessons for future conflicts. The monument in Foy lists 14 names, the soldiers killed in the January 13th assault. 14 names representing 14 lives, 14 families who received telegrams, 14 sets of potential futures that ended in Belgian snow. The monument doesn't mention the 28 wounded, the psychological casualties, the survivors who struggled for decades with trauma and guilt. It doesn't calculate exchange ratios or strategic value. It simply states that these specific people died in this specific place on this specific date. And perhaps that's the most appropriate memorial. Not celebration or justification or mythologization, but simple acknowledgement that they lived, they fought, they died, and we remember them. Not the heroic version or the tragic version or the strategic version, just the human version, complicated, contradictory, irreconcilable, and ultimately all we have.